We would like to call this meeting of the Provo Municipal Council work session to order. Today is Tuesday, September 7th, 2021. The time is 12:33. Meetings of the Municipal Council are now being held in hybrid fashion. Members of the public may continue to view council meetings on YouTube and Facebook, or they may attend in person in the council chamber at the Provo City Center. The mayor, councilors, city staff, and any presenters are participating in the council chamber or by using Zoom webinar. The coronavirus is not yet over, but vaccines are available. We encourage everyone who's eligible to get vaccinated. We encourage all people to protect themselves and others by following the protocols set by the CDC and our state and local health departments. Please stay safe and be kind. This meeting is being broadcast live on the web on the Provo City Council YouTube channel, where it will also be available for on-demand viewing. I remind participants to mute your microphone when not speaking, so as to minimize the potential for background noises and conversations to be picked up, recorded, and broadcast for all to hear. I believe we have three council members here in the chamber, three participating remotely, and Shannon Ellsworth, who'll be joining us soon. We also have Mayor Kafusi here with us, and Isaac Paxman, and other members of the administration and council staff here with us. Today, the opening prayer will be provided by Councilor Handley.
Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we're grateful for this beautiful day and for this opportunity to meet together as a council. We pray that we will have clarity of mind and wisdom in our meetings today, that we will be able to ask good questions and inform ourselves and inform one another. We pray that we will be edified by the exchange of ideas. We pray for this community. We're grateful for the opportunity to serve this great city and ask for thy blessing upon it, that it will be safe and that it will be thriving, and that all people will be able to have the fullest lives possible. We pray that that will keep us healthy and strong. And we pray for these things humbly in the name of thy beloved Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Thank you for that prayer. Although this is a public meeting, only the presenters and those invited by the council may speak or ask questions unless otherwise invited by the chair. If you're participating via Zoom, please use the raised hand feature to indicate that you would like to speak. Please wait to speak until called on by the council chair. If you're sitting at the dais in the council chamber, you'll need to raise your actual hand instead of clicking on an option in Zoom. Muting and unmuting your microphone will need to be done with the red buttons at the dais instead of on the computer in front of you. It is proposed that we approve the following minutes from the August 24th, 2021 work meeting and the September 2nd, 2021 joint meeting with the Provo School Board. Are there any objections or requested changes? Seeing none, I will declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. And we'll move on to our first item of business, which is a presentation regarding fiscal year 2021 budget corrections, to be presented by John Borgett, Administrative Services Director. Welcome, John.
Council. Each year, as we prepare the budget, we have a very large, complex budget that has a lot of moving parts and pieces. Our goal is that we don't have to come back for this. And we spent for this meeting where we have to do some updates. We actually spent a significant amount of time last year. I was involved in it first. As far as thank you, you can hear me now. Maybe I'll start over. So appreciate that, Elizabeth. So as I was mentioned, our budget is for the city is very large and complex. There's a lot of moving parts and components, and And there's, our goal is that each year we won't have to come back with any corrections, but we did identify some. We actually found these in July, decided to wait a couple of months to see if there's anything else that surfaced, but we haven't had any other issues. But they are fairly minor. I mentioned that we have, one of the things that we do at the city is we basically have different departments that are internal service funds that charge other departments for services. There were two items, one for facility maintenance contracts for $9,557, and then another for a facility maintenance core charge for $2,311 that were not included in the department's budget. We've made that correction and shouldn't have that problem again. And then we had an employee in a function of fire that we hadn't had employees in that function before. It's 1309. And so we did not include the wages for that for $28,114. So that's about that increases the budget for the general fund by about $40,000, $39,982. And then towards the end of the budget process, Energy submitted some items electronically to finance to update their budget for 4 different areas. And those items, Energy intended those to be included in the budget, but they were not. And that totals $83,296. And so for a total of all funds, that's a net increase of $123,278. I would just mention that the finance division and the administrative services department takes pride in our work, and we're doing everything we can possible to hopefully have a year where we don't have to come back with any minor corrections. We'd like the budget to be exact and not have any errors, but if there are errors, we try to be transparent and come back and make the council aware of it and have you approve this. So, and even if we were to have errors that were going the other direction, didn't require an appropriation, which we had last year, we would still be transparent and come back and share those with you as well. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Do we have any questions for Mr. Borgett? Mr. Hanley?
Are there any revenues in the general fund that are being used to cover these expenses?
Well, we didn't go back and identify a source of revenue to offset this. So it does basically utilize fund balance, but we are continuing to see sales tax revenues quite strong throughout the city. And we feel, based on where we're at right now, in September, that we're in a good position on revenues, and we think that it's likely that we'll have revenues to cover for this. But no, we haven't gone back and increased the budget on any revenues. That's a good question. And that's for the $39,982 portion. Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Borgett. You mentioned that your department takes pride in their work, and I just want to let you know that we take pride in your work too. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
We'll move on to item number 2, which is a presentation regarding the Parkway Village Increment Finance Reimbursement Agreement relating to the second payment and budget appropriation for that. And this will be presented by Keith Morey, Development Services Assistant Director.
Thank you very much. This should be quick. We came to you, I'm trying to remember, it was very early this year with the one that sales tax reimbursement agreement we did for Days Market. This is the second one that we're doing. If you remember right, these agreements we've already entered into. The city council's already approved these, but as the sales tax year, as we work through that, we work with each property owner to identify the businesses, make sure we capture what sales tax has been created above the base, and then we generate what the calculation is. We come back to you for the appropriation. So for this year, the amount is $12,855. A year ago when we did this, the amount was $26,820. So you can see, just because of COVID last year, some of those numbers really dipped. But in our looking at where they are, it looks like those numbers are starting to rebound. So the number will probably be back up for next year. But I don't know if you have any questions. These are agreements that you've already approved and entered into, but we just are trying to do the calculations and get them their portion of the reimbursement.
Any questions for Mr. Maury?
So we'll be back in 2 weeks with the actual resolution for the appropriation, but basically it'll just be an appropriation for that $12,800. All right. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you.
Told you to be quick.
Mr. Strachan?
Mr. Chair, this doesn't happen very often, but we're now 17 minutes ahead of schedule.
That's great. Is there a problem?
Only if Mr. Hedman's not ready to go.
Okay.
Might be worth letting Kelsey know we're ahead of schedule too.
I was planning to run over there. I'll be over in the council in 5 minutes. Or do you want me to do it by Zoom?
Yes. Go ahead. If you're able to join us on Zoom, we would love to hear your presentation, Mr. Hedman.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your time. Kelsey's going to present a little more detail when she gets over there on the financing end of this and where the money came from, but I can speak to what we plan to use the money for. So the pictures show here the last two vehicles we purchased with the lease money that was approved a couple of years ago. The one is our heavy rescue, the one without the ladder, and that just is a huge toolbox that carries an enormous amount of tools and gives us some incredible capabilities in the city. The one on the my right is the ladder truck that was purchased with that grant money or with the lease money. If we'll go down to the next slide. So basically there's a $65,000 and some change, 65,500 or so, that was earned in interest money from the lease. So these are some of the equipment that we didn't purchase because we didn't have enough money when we first bought the heavy rescue. And here's some equipment we would like to purchase with that money. The first item is a Raman spectrometry, which basically just helps us identify different types of chemicals on an emergency scene. It's a pretty neat, the picture on the bottom left shows you can put it right up to a bottle, not ever open the container, and it'll help us identify what we're dealing with. The next item is a swift water kit, which is just 2 of those, which just helps us augment the equipment we have now. We'd like to purchase 1 large area search system, which just is it's a cache of equipment that we use for searching for large auditoriums or big buildings where we can't stay safe just on a hose line. And then our confined space fan that we have on the heavy rescue came from our old one, and it's not compatible with some of the new equipment we have, so we'd like to upgrade that. And then the rescue standard pole is just a way to do water rescue that is safe, a little safer because we can stretch it out into the river and not have to put people in the river if somebody's conscious and can grab it. That's the extent of our equipment. The next slide's just showing our equipment as well, or some of our apparatus, but I don't know if Kelsey made it in yet. Looks like she's walking in.
Yes, she is walking in right now. Uh-huh.
Hi, I'm Kelsey, and I'm sorry, I didn't realize this agenda item was going already, but Jeremy, am I just talking about the funding source?
Yes, if you would.
Okay, perfect. So the funding for this appropriation request that's on the agenda tonight is from fire truck lease proceeds that have been accruing interest. And so it's the interest amount that is the appropriation amount. And basically the way the lease was structured when we originally were seeking to purchase 2 fire trucks was that any interest accrued on the lease proceeds would need to be spent on equipment related to the fire trucks. And so It's $65,650. And Jeremy, I'm guessing you already went through the breakthrough of that?
I did.
Okay, so that's the whole source of that appropriation spending. Are there questions about that?
Mr. Harding?
Yeah, it's just kind of in the rounding. The description says that it's earned on lease proceeds up to 65,000, and this is 65,534. So is the 534 coming out of the general fund, or how?
So I think it's up to the 65,650 just because like we would appropriate it tonight, but I think by the time that we actually draw the money, there might be like a couple $100 extra in the lease proceeds that come through. And so that was Dan Follett's conservative estimate of how much we would want to appropriate. So up to that amount, but maybe less.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
If anything was to go above this, the amount that's available, it would just come out of the fire department budget to cover the remainder.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
We'll move on to item number 3 then, or excuse me, item number 4, which is a discussion on the American Rescue Plan Act parameters and priorities. And this item is to be presented by Kelsey Zarbach, Provo City Budget Officer.
Okay, this is different than our fire appropriation. So today, I understand that the council wanted an update on the ARPA money, the America Rescue Plan Act money. Just a quick distinction before we get into that. So ARPA is kind of the overarching act that Congress passed, but Provo's allocation that we'll specifically be talking about today is from the state and local fiscal recovery fund of that act. And so it's often abbreviated in materials as SLFRF. So if you see that, that's just the distinction, and it might become more important to make that distinction over time because, for example, the state, they received funding from the ARPA Act, and they might let us have some of that funding. So it's still ARPA money, but Provo's allocation that we specifically have is SLFRF funding. So just to avoid confusion in the future. John, are you manning this? Oh, do I have that? Oh, sweet. Okay. So just a quick refresher, you've probably already seen this information before, but Provo has been allocated an amount of $33.89 million divided in 2 increments. So we received the first increment of $16.9 million in June of this year, and then we'll receive the second half in June of next year. So that is how the disbursements are working. The spending timeline, though, is a little bit more prolonged. So even though we'll have the money sooner up front, the encumbrance deadline for spending it isn't until December 31st, 2024. So that gives us over 3 years to even encumber the money. Then the spending deadline is December 31st, 2026. And so that's 5 years about. So there isn't a huge rush to go out and spend this money. And that's probably a good thing just because we go to the next slide. This is a list of references, resources on the SLFRF money. It's hyperlinked in your packets and everything, so you should be able to click through these if you have questions in the future about potential projects. But that second bullet point on there, interim final rule, that's basically the official legislation about this funding. And it still says interim final rule. And so basically the Treasury Department in July, they had collected a bunch of feedback from local governments and states, just saying what they liked about it, what they didn't like, and they're still compiling that feedback and trying to integrate some of it into their final rule. And so while I don't think they're potentially going to limit what's already in the interim final rule, they might expand some uses, they might make it even more flexible than it is. And so that's why it's nice to have an encumbrance deadline in 2024 and a spending deadline in 2026, because if there are opportunities that become available in the final rule, we don't want to miss out on those potentially. So,
Looks like Mr. Shipley has a question for you.
oh, yes.
Yeah, just a quick question on those deadlines. So they've differentiated encumbering the funds with completing or spending the funds. But if we were to start a large infrastructure project and get delayed because everybody else in the country is doing infrastructure projects at the same time, how do we, what's the penalty or what's the risk of not spending before the end of 2026? Not because we don't have a project in the works, but because we can't facilitate that speed.
From what I've read so far on that is if you don't spend it by December 31st, 2026, then you need to remit the funds back to the Treasury Department. Again, I don't know if they'd start getting flexible because people are running into deadlines like that, but at this point, that's our deadline. And so we would want to spend it before then.
Thank you.
Yep. Okay. So again, just looking at these resources, John, I don't know if you can click on the quick reference guide, that first link on the PowerPoint. Does that work? Great. So if you scroll down to the second page, this is probably the shortest overview I've seen of the SLFRF funding. And so you can see examples for uses of funds here. It's a good starting point to just kind of get an idea of what you can spend this money on. And so obviously you can spend it on supporting public health. The second one down, replacing public sector revenue loss, is something Provo considered, but the way that we were reading the interim final rule was such that you need to replace revenue overall as a city, and Provo only lost revenue but in certain funds, not overall as a city. So that's probably something that we wouldn't look into as much, although some cities in the country would definitely benefit from that. Water and sewer infrastructure is something that might be of interest to Provo, just given our capital improvement project list coming up. There are lots of projects that could apply. Equity-focused services and addressing negative economic impacts are kind of related, but this is just helping citizens, community members, organizations that might need a little bit of extra help. And they have specific guidelines and criteria for who can meet that assistance level. Premium pay for essential workers. This could include public safety, although they've gotten more specific in the ARPA funding to say that it can't just be supplementing your public safety payroll. It needs to be actually for public safety individuals who have been dedicated to COVID-19 mitigation. And so just things like that are important to keep in mind, that they're getting a little bit more narrow with their definitions there. Broadband infrastructure is another category, and then they include ineligible uses right there. So that's a good resource just to kind of trigger your memory if you're trying to remember what types of projects are eligible. If we could go back to the PowerPoint, there are a few other things up there. A fact sheet, which is also kind of a watered down help for interim final rule guidance. The FAQs, very helpful. I've heard a few things just from throughout the city just that I've found in the FAQs. Like, for example, let's see. Can nonprofit or private organizations receive funds? That's answered in FAQ 1.8. And the answer to that is yes. Like, you can partner with nonprofits or community organizations. Basically, these organizations would be receiving grants, and we would be the pass-through entity. So we'd still be responsible for how they spend the money. We'd have to be responsible for reporting how they spend the money and all of that, but we can partner with outside organizations. Another question is, would investments in improving outdoor spaces like parks be an eligible use of funds? And the answer to that is it depends. And so going into FAQ 2.18 on that sheet would give you a lot of information about what would qualify. If you look at the next bullet point, it's a qualified census tract map link, and a lot of projects to help people in the community are often under the caveat of they need to live, or the project needs to occur within a qualified census tract location determined by HUD. So this map is from 2021, this year, and I think it's on the next slide, actually. This shows in purple where Provo's areas are, And so that's something you'd want to reference if you're looking at specific projects in terms of helping with economic development or helping citizens. And then finally, there are links here to eligible wastewater and water projects. They want the projects to be outlined here in one of these two documents, which are provided by the EPA. So we would just want to make sure that if we are considering funding a wastewater or water project, that the project type is on one of these lists. And so that's another place to consult before you commit to a project. Okay, so this is almost the end. I just wanted to highlight the fact that while we already have $16 million and more coming next year, keep the spending timeline in mind, just because there are other resources that we might be able to tap into in the future for SLFRF eligible projects. So obviously we have Provo's allocation, but there's also currently an opportunity for the city to apply for the state's COVID-19 local matching grant program. And what that is it's $50 million available statewide. So when you think about the whole state, it's probably not the largest pot of money, but they're still opening it up to local governments to apply for money for projects that are SLFRF eligible. And so the deadline for that grant is September 15th next week. And so I know that some of our departments have been kind of looking at their criteria, trying to see if they have any projects that meet that, but Provo would have to commit to matching at some level. And so they're working on proposals of where the matching funds would come from, potentially our SLFRF allocation, but maybe other sources. So we'll have more information about that soon. And then again, just going back to how we talked about ARPA being an overall act category, the state might receive other ARPA funds through different departments that would then trickle down into other types of grants that the city could apply for. We just don't know what those are yet. So other funding is potentially forthcoming through those sources. And then finally, there's an infrastructure bill in Congress right now, hasn't been passed. We're not sure what it's going to look like, but that could also inform us on how we want to spend our ARPA money on wastewater and water projects and that kind of thing. So just, that's kind of the big picture right now. Again, I don't think there's been a lot of commitments to what we want to spend this on, just because we're still waiting for the final rule. We're still waiting to kind of see how some of these other funding options play out, and because the deadline is still pretty far in the future for even encumbering the funds. So do you have any questions based on that? And I know you also just want to have a discussion, so that's totally fine.
Mr. Hardy?
I do have some thoughts for the discussion, but for doing that later, I noticed it looks like Mrs. Arbach has a new job title, and so congratulations on that promotion. The city continues being very capable hands, so thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Any questions? All right, thank you very much. And thanks for pointing that out, Mr. Hardy. We'll now turn it over to the council and the administration for any discussion on this item. This is something that we're going to be working together on for quite a while, I think. Mr. Handley.
Yeah, I've got a question just about the issue of those most affected by the pandemic, since that seems to be the most logical reason for these funds and the most maybe important reason for them. But I don't know what kind of metric we have. I don't know if the administration has some ideas, but you know, how do we measure that? How do we know which communities have been the hardest hit and how to help? And that could, I mean, by communities, I'm assuming we are talking not only about sort of city demographics among the citizens, but also maybe certain economies that have been hurt, certain businesses that have been hurt. Do we I mean, I just want to make sure we don't bypass that opportunity, but I don't know how we're going to be able to see the opportunities.
I haven't been in on any discussions where we've tried to drill down on that. It's a really good question. And I think we do need to think about that. Is it, yeah, I think we've talked somewhat about, the qualified census tracts and those kind of things, but can you look at it other ways? Can you look at, different groups in the community and say this group, and we've talked about, there's been some discussion of, for a while, at least the numbers among Hispanics being higher in some of the COVID things. And can we look at it that way? But again, we haven't appreciate the question, because I think we do need to spend some time and look at different ways we can look at that and maybe ask other communities how they're addressing it.
Mr. Hardy?
In scanning through and skimming through some of those hundreds of pages of guidance, I felt like there was a kind of a logical order to how those permitted uses were listed there. And for the number one, I believe was about the response. And we've talked recently about how we might, continue to respond and encourage people to get vaccinated, for example. So I think if there's those kind of expenditures, I think those, should be high up priority and seem to work for this. The second, I think, was to offset lost revenues, which we've talked about is Provo financially was able to manage the storm very well. And so there may not be much there. I think the third one down jumps right into water and wastewater. And I think that is something that we as a community have been grappling with for a couple of years now. And we made some very painful rate increases in order to fund our new wastewater treatment plant. And, those are increases that I think impacted every single resident and business in Provo. And so I think, that's, I think a great opportunity to maybe bring those rates back down to something more reasonable and benefit every resident of Provo. So I'm encouraged. I would encourage, carefully considering how we might leverage that towards our wastewater treatment plant.
Mayor?
It was really interesting. I had the privilege of sitting on the board for the Recovery American Rescue Plan Act for the whole county. And actually it went up into Park City and Heber and even Camas. And the group that did the study and was handing us the information, it was fascinating that the bigger cities always fare better, right? When it comes to stuff like this, because we have the resources, we have the bigger community. To hear from the representative from Camas and some of the smaller communities, they were the ones that got hit the hardest and didn't have the help that we had and don't have the tax base and the ability to forward think like we are with our aquifer restoration program and our new sewer system that's going to benefit the city for 50 years and all these things that we do have the ability. And actually the gentleman that was presenting after he studied Provo, he just said, this is who you all need to follow because they've figured it out. They are aggressive and we are aggressive. And that's what I love about all of you. You're all willing to, if we need to take a quick left turn because we have to, we just do it. And you've been super supportive. But I will say that it was disheartening to hear of these smaller communities and everything they had to go through during this and trying to think of how we can all lift them. And it kind of came down to the same things. Let the big cities help you because we do have the resources. So anything we can do to lift those smaller communities, I was all on board for.
Councilor Shipley?
Thank you, Mayor. Maybe along those lines, when we were talking, I think in our leadership meeting about this grant, matching grants program that I'll be attending a meeting for on Thursday, I think, with the administration. I wanted to bring this up just because I wanted to give any counselors the opportunity to give me input. I'm taking notes on what Mr. Harding and Mr. Hanley have both said, and I want to make sure that I understand kind of priorities from all the counselors before I go to that meeting. But maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong, Mayor or Isaac. But I understood for the matching grants specifically, and the 50 million that we'll be talking about that is available to the entire state. To your point, Mayor, about how smaller communities are probably prioritized, will probably be prioritized above those larger cities who have more resource and have fared, relatively better, during this crisis. And 50 million is not a lot of money, right, among every city in the state, as I think Ms. Zarbach referred to earlier as well. But obviously, we're going to try to get grants. We're going to apply for what might be available to us. And so I've taken notes, like I say, from counselors so far, and I'd be interested in other counselors' feedback on, your priorities for what we should be applying for as far as grants, and then, how that interacts with the ARPA money in general. But one of the things that the administration had mentioned was that they may prioritize those grants based on, regional benefit, on priority to water, or, projects as it relates to water, and then also housing projects as something that might relate to housing. And so I just wanted to put those priorities out there as, they might help us, if we focus on those three specifically, it might help us for the grant part of this to accomplish some kind of grant. So anyway, thought I'd throw that information out there. Administration can correct me if I'm wrong on those priorities, but just also wanted to solicit from other counselors the need for me to have your priorities noted from today so that I can go into that meeting on Thursday prepared.
Mayor?
Yeah, so we're so glad that Dave Shipley's going to join us for this meeting. And we did we sent out an email asking everybody to send in your ideas. We're not going into this blind. We know very well that 50 million is not a lot of money. And after my previous meeting where we did the debrief and they talked about the smaller communities, I see it being spread out pretty evenly, giving something to small communities and things like that, probably higher up than us, but it doesn't hurt to ask, right? And they will be really wise. They'll be like, Provo does this and this, let's give them. I just tell my folks, even if we get $1 million, $1 million is $1 million, we'll take it.
Thank you. I neglected to mention also that Councillor Ellsworth joined us some time ago in the meeting. Mr. Harding.
I appreciate the discussion that's happened so far, and this is just a kind of a thought of probably what's basically already been said. But as far as helping some of the surrounding communities as well, as part of our kind of our COVID mitigation strategy that we've been working on the last month or so, we talked a lot about creating these resources that can be used by other communities and whatnot. And so that might be a way where we can both leverage the resources and the talent that we have as a larger city, but also help the other cities around us. So I don't know if that's something that we could work in towards, that some of that grant money. What if we developed a little bit more and spread it a little bit wider or something? So anyway, it's just, I think there may be some synergy in there that the state would actually really encourage.
Thank you.
Just maybe a good time to reiterate, I think we've all heard it, but I mean, this aquifer storage and recovery program is really being touted as a pilot program for the state, and one that with every discussion we've had with county commissioners, with legislators, even with the offices of our federal legislators, there's good support for it. We're trying to, make this a real coalition effort and get spending from lots of different groups. But that is one thing that makes this one stand out. And I'm confident we're going to be applying for the matching grant from the state on that one and trying to really highlight that, it fits that really well, that it'll be something that others can do too.
Thank you. Mr. Harding.
I know Mr. Shipley was saying he was taking notes. I don't know if you could see me nodding my head at that comment, but let me just indicate my support for what Mr. Paxman just talked about.
Thank you. One thought I've had, it does seem that it would be appropriate to use some portion of this to help those hardest hit by the pandemic. And it seems like in line with what we discussed earlier about the possibility of collaborating with private entities, that we may want to look at some kind of collaboration with entities like the Food and Care Coalition, United Way, and others that might be really tuned in to where the money could do the most good concerning those who have been affected the most negatively. Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I want to add my support for that statement of Mr. Sewell's. When I spoke with the Food and Care Coalition, who was it? Spoke with one of our local nonprofits who serves homeless populations. They thought there might be some regional synergy to create a homeless resource center in the northern part of the county. And that may not be the highest and best use of this money, but I think that considering that kind of big idea that has a regional impact that relieves some of the pressure we're experiencing would be really worthwhile.
Councillor Hanley.
Yeah, I had some email exchanges with Karen McCandless, and she had some really good ideas. So I do think maybe going back to my initial question in this issue of finding out who needs help, I think you've put your finger on it. I think that we've already got people working on the ground, and I think maybe we got to gather those people together and get their input.
Thank you. Councillor Fillmore.
Thank you, Chair. I want to endorse what's just been said. I think we need to focus right off the bat on those groups that have been particularly disadvantaged during the pandemic. There are certainly some worthy recipients of some of these funds. But as an overall major priority, I think we just need to focus on infrastructure. We're looking at one-time monies potentially. And Provo is undergoing rapid change, increasing population, particularly in the southeast, southwest. And I think to the extent that we can funnel funds, not just the matching money, but the ARPA money, into anticipating that growth and taking care of infrastructure needs now, we'll be forever grateful we did it.
Thank you.
I think that focus on the infrastructure has been a major priority from the administration. Is again, let's look for the 50-year benefit for the whole community. If we can do that, again, that's probably about as good as we can do.
Councillor Shipley.
I just have maybe a question, and it's something that keeps coming up in my mind, even though we've addressed the CBDG money that was for small businesses. As that money isn't being used or utilized for small business because of the parameters, that we're just precluding business owners from getting access and wanting to utilize that pool. Are those funds, I know CBDG has made grants to, like different community action programs in the past. And I just wonder if that pool of money would be eligible for some of this response that we're talking about as well. And I just don't know the answer to that. So I wonder if anybody from the administration could maybe speak to whether or not those funds would be eligible to transition to grants to local non-for-profits that are trying to, help the hardest hit at this point.
I can give you a kind of answer. I would have to go back to the sources to look in detail, but I think in terms of like the general economy, The ARPA money can really only cover, let's see, it was travel, tourism, and hospitality sectors, and then you can compare sectors to those three overall categories. But you can provide aid through grants, or I think maybe even kind of a loan situation to smaller businesses. I can't remember exactly what the criteria is for these small businesses to meet. We might need to define that ourselves and then go from there. But I think there's more information in the interim final rule or the frequently asked questions that can help us figure out what assistance we can give to small businesses.
Thank you. Any other thoughts? I imagine we'll be talking about this for quite a while to come. So if there's no other questions or comments at this point, let's move on to our next item. Next item of business is item number 5, a discussion on a percent for arts program and a city center water feature. Oh, I didn't realize I was listed as the presenter here. I'll just start it off, and then there's several other people I think that I'll hand off to in just a minute. But I think the percent for arts sort of preliminary discussion, from what I remember, first came up when the administration team returned from Colorado on a recent trip and pointed out some of the great public art that was there. And I think it was Wayne that mentioned that one of the cities had this percent for arts program, and talked about how there's some other cities in Utah that have it, and it seemed like a worthwhile idea to me at the time to consider for Provo. And Councilor Shipley has since brought it up several times in leadership discussions. I believe he's our liaison to the Arts Council from the council. And every time I hear him talk about it, I also get that same feeling that this just feels like a good long-term policy to consider for the city. It's just so easy for art to get cut from a project. It's probably usually the first thing to go. Let me just say one other thing, and then I'm going to turn a little time over to Councilor Shipley. So we're really talking about two things here. The first thing is a preliminary discussion amongst the council and the administration as to whether long-term we should be, we would like to consider establishing some type of percent for art program. So that's kind of the overarching part of the discussion. And then more specifically, we have a specific feature in the city center that's an artistic element, and due to cost overruns is kind of in jeopardy right now. And so as part of this discussion, there is the question of whether we should do an appropriation from other funding sources to save that feature. And for that part of it, I'd like to turn over to the administration. If you could designate someone to kind of just give us a little history on kind of what went into, picking that design feature, how you feel about it, and that kind of thing. So get to you in just a moment, Mr. Henderson, but I want to hear from Councilor Shipley next on the Percent for Arts program. Kind of your thoughts on it.
Yeah, so thank you. So I've had conversations with some of you, some of the counselors already on this, and as Chair Sewell mentioned, I've brought it up a few different times in different meetings. I was encouraged and I guess excited after hearing of other cities and other even states. I was encouraged when I researched the state of Utah's percent for art program, that, you know, this is something that works even in conservative, very conservative areas. You know, I'd consider the state of Utah very conservative fiscally, but yet they've made a significant commitment, I think, through their program to make sure art elements are part of government buildings. And there's always a risk, I think, with government buildings, especially when we're trying to be so careful, as we are, you know, with the public's money and building out new projects, that these buildings can become, well, I don't want to be negative, but they oftentimes become buildings in a city that aren't the most beautiful buildings, and that's a nice way of putting it. We strip out obviously a lot of extras because it's not meant to be a corporate looking building, and it's the public money. So we have to be very careful, right, about how we spend and what these buildings look like and what goes into these buildings. But at the same token, and in a recent example is the courthouse, right, the new courthouse here in Provo. That art fixture, I did a little bit of research, was about $300,000 or just over $300,000, which is a lot of money for a piece of art, a sculpture in front of a building. But I think that it makes a significant difference in how that building looks overall to have that piece in front. So anyway, just as a small point of reference, but I think from city to city, I think we can, I'll speak for myself. When I go to a city that has intriguing art, that has artistic elements to it, around the downtown, for example, or even other places. And for obviously for the city of Provo, it would be all over Provo to try to benefit from some kind of art program. But I think it's a significant draw, and I feel a little bit of a little bit heavier responsibility for Provo as it pertains to the whole county, because I really do view us as the heart and center of the county. And I think we have a little bit more of a responsibility to make something that looks and feels welcoming and good. I also think for business, it's a significant draw to have artistic elements. I think it's a great thing for business owners and local businesses to have things that draw people in from other communities, that when somebody looks at TripAdvisor on a place to go, that if there's some kind of artistic element and somebody's on a road trip, that means something. And some of you might not, take road trips like I do, but when I go through different cities, we take a road trip every spring with our family somewhere around the country, and we'll pay extra close attention, in these different cities that we go to artistic elements, and want to enjoy those as a family. And then we're going to be eating somewhere there close. So anyway, I know that's just my own personal experience, and definitely my personal experience weighs heavily on this. But I do think it's an important concept to have some kind of commitment to art that doesn't allow the fact that we're always trying to be so cautious and careful and tight with the financing of new construction that will almost always, take the art element off the table first, as those construction costs go up. And so, like Chair Sewell said, I think it's an important commitment that we at some point as administration and city need to take seriously and make a significant commitment to this going forward for the future.
Councillor Fillmore, did you have a question for Councillor Shipley? You're muted.
I just wanted to add a hearty amen to what David has said. I think aesthetics are important, and they're particularly important here in Provo, where we are the center of the county. I think it does aid businesses, but beautification of our downtown area is, I think, a key issue. The city has been doing really good things the last 10, 12 years to enhance aesthetics here in the city, and I think it's necessary to continue that. This water feature in particular is something that I would endorse. I would like to know the price tag on it prospectively, but it segues nicely into another issue that some members of the council and I have been promoting, and that is the need and the opportunity to improve those gateway areas into the city. Talking now about West Center in particular, going out to I-15. This would be a nice addition, and maybe even kickstart some efforts in that regard as we try to improve those 6-7 blocks out to the freeway. in terms of their aesthetics as well as potentially their retail utility. So I appreciate Mr. Shipley highlighting the need, and I thought his reasons for it were just on point.
Thank you, Mr. Fillmore. We do have one more presenter. Is this okay? Let's go ahead and hear from the administration on this. Feel free to comment on both issues if you'd like. You know, the percent for art sort of as a long-term policy, and then particularly on the water feature. Your thoughts on that?
Thank you, council and administration, for addressing this issue. I think the water feature in front of City Hall, and it was part of, for those of you that were at the open house for City Hall, was something that came up with a lot of people about a water feature up front. We were somewhat non-committal, and as we go through a pretty difficult construction season, that might be my understatement of the year, in that we have held this project and looked for a compatible art element that utilizes water as a feature. And we're showing one of the images right now that serves as that gateway that Councilmember Fillmore talked about, but also serves as something completely unique and something that our architect says has not been done at any city hall. It's a water wall, which looks beautiful when you're not projecting any images on it. And it also, at the evening, when sometimes City Hall is less vibrant, it provides that gateway look and that vibrancy to downtown that we thought matched on both sides. As fountains and water features go, they're very expensive elements. And this is probably about a third of the cost of a lot of the other features we looked at. So it not only has the impact, but it matches both from an economic standpoint as we go through. As we've looked at the City Hall budget, and my job is to bring the City Hall in budget and on time. When we looked at carrying this cost only in the project and entirely in the project, it was probably going to have an effect on any contingencies going to the end. And so where we decided maybe this wasn't me the time, but Councilmember Sewell, who I thought was a visionary problem solver in this, came to me and said, well, let's talk about this and talk about the costs and see if there are ways to make this happen, because we all want to finish up with a next level City Hall. And I think this type of addition not only adds to the vibrancy of the plaza outside the City Hall, but it adds to the overall vibrancy perception of our community too.
Anything else the administration would like to add?
Just, I do think, you know, the discussion of gateways is an important one. And I do think this can be viewed from a lens of art. It can be viewed from the lens of the City Hall. It can be viewed from the lens of gateway. It can be viewed, I think, from a lens of economic development. Is a developer more inclined, a retailer more inclined to maybe bring their business to downtown Provo with that feature? I think it'd be hard to measure, but I think you can look at it from that lens too.
And on the 1%, I was since the Arts Council is part of the Parks and Recreation Department boards, I was in that meeting with Councilmember Shipley, and I give him a ton of credit for bringing this forward and moving it so fast. And I do feel like there was a lot of enthusiasm in the Arts Council and from our citizen group that represents this concept. And I really, I think it's admirable how quickly this discussion is moving along. So I think it's an exciting project that could really change the look and feel of Provo forever.
Thank you. Councilor Ellsworth?
Yeah, I have a question and then I have some comments. My question is the cost for the water feature. I think in an email it said it was 600,000. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And if you'll permit me, Chair Sewell, I'll continue with my comments.
Let's just see if there's any other questions maybe, and before we bring it back for discussion, if that's all right.
Sure.
And does anyone else have any questions for Mr. Henderson or the administration before we proceed with discussion? Mr. Paxman.
Were you going to walk through the approach if we didn't have funding and what that would look like if we had to make the decision later, or is that?
I could. So we are doing some of the sleeves and putting those into the concrete so that you could do an installation later. I think what the architect cautioned on was that if you decide to do it later, then you are taking out concrete that is brand new concrete, just been poured, and it would have a substantial impact on the front plaza. The project side and the project contribution of this can come from, and I think it's somewhat appropriate that we have been able to save money in our concrete finishes, and we've been able to save money in on some of our concrete scope. We've also have some other elements within the overall project where the Provo City, because of efficient use and efficient and construction and efficient design, we've been able to pull some back for that, and that the project could, within its element, contribute the $200,000 towards the fountain and be able to maintain, a healthy contingency going into the last 9 months of this project.
So just to clarify, my understanding is that the current shortfall is about 400,000 then is what would be needed.
It is, council members. So
in an additional appropriation. And also just to clarify on the timeline, in order to not incur any additional cost, we would need to make the decision basically by the end of this month. Is that right?
Our construction team is rounding the corner right now, coming to the front plaza. So this month would be our last opportunity to be able to say the project is in and not have poured the concrete for the front plaza.
Thank you. So given that, councilors, kind of what we're thinking is that the discussion today would sort of determine whether there is support to do that appropriation before the end of the month. And then if a majority feels like there is, then we would schedule that for our next meeting on September 21st. Any other questions? Mr. Paxman.
And Mayor, feel free to dial us back at all, but I would just want to, in case it's not known to anyone, this was very painful to see this have to get taken off. But again, the mayor's priority is on time, on time and under budget. But this has been something the administration has been very excited about. And when we heard that unsolicited, and we didn't come asking the council to, but when we heard that there was even the consideration that, hey, maybe the council could find a way, we were very grateful that you would even think about it. I think again, anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but we think it'd be amazing if you could figure out a way to bring this back. It just will. It's money and that, but if there's a way to add that, it really does add that dynamic feature that just is kind of a capstone to the project. Again, there's utility to it too. Remember, you can put any words you want on this and any colors you want on this. So you can say, welcome to Provo. You can say, welcome PEG, PEG development. You can say, Covey Center for the Arts, March 5th, you'd have to take some time to do it, but you could say to this, come see XYZ program. So there's utility to it too. Anyway, thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Strachan.
So when we talked about this at staff, at our leadership meeting last week, the goal from today's discussion was for the council to make a decision one way or the other about whether they wanted to appropriate monies to cover the gap in the funding because of the timing of having to bring it back on the 21st of September if we were to do that. And the second was around the bigger policy of, do you want to have a 1% or a percent for arts program and how to do that? And so from the staff perspective, we think there's two decisions for the council to move forward on one way or the other.
Thank you. I think that's all the questions for now, Mr. Henderson, but we may end up calling you back up possibly, but
You bet. Thank you.
thank you very much. Mr. Hanley.
Yeah, thank you. I certainly support whatever we can do to bring the water feature back. So with regard to item number one, count me in. I think we should put it on our agenda and look for a way to fund it. And I think the larger question of a % for arts program is, I support it as well. I think there are a lot of cities in Utah and of course anywhere else in the world that develop around a certain kind of personality that they're known for. And some of them, like Springville, claim a certain trademark as Art City, or Spring City has been known for many years for its arts. But Provo hasn't really capitalized on that yet. And I mean, I think we have an abundance of visual artists in this community, and we have a wonderful mural tradition in the city. We've just seen glimpses, I think, here and there. We've got a wonderful art stroll. But I think we can capitalize on that more. I think we can make that more sort of more marketed part of our identity. I mention often our musical contributions in this city and our musicians. So I think the performing arts are extraordinary in Provo. So most people who pay attention to the arts know that Provo has a tremendous amount to contribute, but I don't think people outside of the Provo community know that as much as people inside of it. And I think often, people assume that all of the things that matter that happen in the arts are happening north of the point of the mountain, for example, and don't realize how much is going on down here. So I think it's, I'm a humanities professor, so from just pure value, from the point of view of values, I think any community that values the arts is doing right. But I think from a marketing point of view, it's foolish not to take better advantage of that identity and help people understand that we aren't just a community that offers first-class outdoor recreation, but we're a community that offers tremendous contributions in the arts. So I'm 100% supportive of the % for arts idea, and I would look forward to having that discussion. And I do think the water feature is worth saving and would be a step in the right direction. So whatever it takes to do it in the best way, I think I want to have that conversation.
Thank you, Councillor Ellsworth.
Yeah, to the first question about the % for arts program, I'm in favor of that. I think that's a worthwhile endeavor, especially in a town where we have a university and then another adjacent university. I think there's a really strong culture for arts, and and we have the opportunity to collaborate with these universities to create art. I am not in favor of the water wall. My primary concerns are water and money. I think this might signal to citizens that we're trying to look like the Bellagio. And there was also, there was significant pushback against this bond for City Hall. And I think it was the right thing to do to rebuild City Hall. Absolutely. I don't think it's the right thing to do to signal to citizens that we're willing to spend $600,000 on one element that's considered art by some people. $600,000 is more than my house costs. And as I mentioned to one citizen, I said, this is what the city's considering. And they said, a water wall, a water feature, we're in a drought. What does that signal to citizens? And as I thought through that, I said, we ought to be conservative with our funds, and we ought to be conservative with our water consumption. And right across the street, we have a phenomenal water feature, which is the splash pad. So it feels spendy. It feels consumptive. It feels somewhat redundant. So I'd like us to see different alternatives to this $600,000 water feature. I think there might be an opportunity to collaborate on multiple pieces of art for half the price. I think there might be opportunities to consider moving the Provo Strong statue from the rec center to this spot, or to create a comparable sister statue. I think that there are alternatives that do not make Provo look like a spendy, consumptive, water guzzling Bellagio style town. But I certainly agree that we should invest in the arts generally. That's definitely an important part of any culture.
Thank you. Councillor Fillmore.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. I suppose when it comes to art, things get a little subjective. I certainly don't see this as a Bellagio type project. It's not just art, there's also the utility element, which has been highlighted by Mr. Shipley and others. So I wish to second the impassioned statement by my favorite humanities professor and say I'm in favor of not only the 1%, but also this water feature in particular. I think it finishes the building off nicely. I think it'll synergize some other things for us downtown.
Thank you. Councillor Shipley.
Maybe not so much a comment as a question for somebody from the administration to help us with the water element to, the water usage. My understanding on an element like this is it's not a significant water user, but maybe I'm wrong on that. So I'd love some feedback on that. And then also maybe just a little bit more context on the process. I think this was heavily vetted before we're looking at it now at this point, and I just don't know that we have that context. I'd like to think that this was a heavily vetted process of finding the right feature at the right cost, and then deciding on this particular one. But I would like to hear from the administration to that end as well.
Administration. Mr. Henderson.
The fountain we are proposing is a recirculating water feature. So similar to us running swimming pools, or even the fountain in front of the rec center, the leaping water fountain that I think a lot of people really enjoy. It adds, so the water usage is part of recirculation. So as there is in some evaporation, but it is not a wasteful, and it is all completely recirculating within the system. And then, yes, there are limitations to the plaza in size, elements, and what you can do in our area to leave the plaza, because it does have an entrance purpose. It does have a protest and demonstration purpose and all those things. So to show respect for those other uses that could happen at the plaza, this element and its footprint leaves a lot of that space in the plaza for it to serve its other purposes too. So a great amount of discussion was had with the architect before this particular item was selected.
Thank you. Councillor Harding.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start broad and then kind of drill down to more specifics. I wanted to suggest that public art is very compatible with conservative values. And I don't necessarily think that there necessarily is a trade-off or a tension between fiscal responsibility and public art. I actually would argue that if we are not providing public art, if we're not addressing that aspect, then we're not fully fulfilling the public purpose for these buildings. I think public art can be an investment that pays dividends long into the future. And I really appreciated how Councillor Handley talked about the importance of public art in communities, and I wanted to echo that. I am broadly supportive of a Percent for Arts program. I think as we saw, looking at how different communities have implemented it, I think there's a lot of parameters that we should take a look at, because it can be done very differently. And so rather than, I don't want to say, I am supportive of any configuration of such a program, but I'm broadly supportive of such a program. And, are we talking about capital improvement expenses, and what does that look like? What does 1% on a sewer project look like? But we should be careful because, I've seen in a lot of communities some great artwork done on utility boxes that really take something would otherwise be an eyesore and it becomes something that contributes. And so, things like electrical infrastructure, might make sense for something, to have this apply to it. So I would look forward to further discussion on and vetting proposals on what exactly that percent for art program would look like. And then more specifically about the water feature at City Hall. Again, I'm mostly supportive of it. My biggest concern, and I appreciated what Mr. Henderson just explained, and because that was the first time that I've heard in connection with this fountain, just the talk of that, the use of that plaza for public gatherings. And just when I've seen the renderings, that has been my biggest concern, is that by placing it where it is, it makes the plaza and the steps much less functional as a public gathering space. And, perhaps that's just the renderings, perhaps that's my misunderstanding of what that plaza would look like, but that's my biggest concern, I would say. And it seems like if that could be pushed back a little closer to the building to the east side and leave that plaza more open. I don't know how loud a water wall would turn out to be, but some of these things might detract from that function of a public gathering. So, hopefully we can take a look at that, and maybe these concerns aren't founded, and it wouldn't be a problem with it as it's designed now. But before I kind of gave final support for such a project, I just would need to understand a little bit more on how that would impact that. And then lastly, it makes a lot of sense. I like the idea of branding and whatnot. I do think we need to be careful. I know some legal concerns have been brought up, but even if all of those are addressed, I would hate to see this kind of just turned into a billboard marquee kind of thing. I think we need to be careful on and just thoughtful about how we use it so that it doesn't detract from the overall experience that we're trying to create at that gateway to our downtown.
Thank you, Mr. Harding. Mr. Hoban, your first comment on this issue.
Yeah, just real briefly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
All right. So I think I like the idea of something dedicated to the arts. And I'm warming up to the idea of the water wall. Although I would like to see, what would be the next things on the list, the next projects on the list for these funds that will be allocated, that we would be allocating towards this. What are the next projects that would be on that list that those funds could potentially go towards? So just would like to see that. And then just from a practical standpoint, I'm on the sign committee, so I wonder if this would be considered some sort of illuminated signage, and if so, limit how often messages could change and such. So just a consideration there. So yeah, I think that's what I'd like to know going into our next discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Hoban. Interesting point on the sign. I guess if this goes forward, we'll have to consider that. Back to you, Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I think because this is a want and not a need, I'm curious if the administration and or the council would be open to soliciting citizens and businesses to support this art feature or water feature instead of using public funds.
Who, not sure who best to answer that. Councilor Shipley?
Yeah, and sorry, the administration would have a more definitive answer on that, but my first thought on that question is that if I were a private entity that helped sponsor this, then it would be a billboard, and I would expect that that could be used for my business, right? And that you would put messaging on it that would help support my business, specifically if I had given money for that to happen. So my personal preference would be that this would remain kind of a sacred spot just for community and public information, not for necessarily any specific one business. I think we go down a road that would be difficult to control and frankly would be off-putting, to other businesses and other people who might have interest in promoting what they're doing. So that would be my first thought. And maybe I'll just state that because I haven't given any feedback, I've just been giving questions and follow up. But one of the things that I think on this that it would be helpful is that I do think, to Mr. Hogan's point, it would be helpful, and this is kind of what I've alluded to earlier, to kind of see, to peel back a little bit more of the process here, the options, the funding available, what other sources might there be funding. I mean, we haven't discussed where funding would come from, but, there might be support for something like this if it was from revenue excess, as far as sales, sales tax revenue excess from the last fiscal year, as opposed to using the legacy fund, for example. We have the ability to appropriate either. And so I think this warrants a little bit more discussion about funding sources, and then also alternatives, and then also, the vetting process like we alluded to earlier. But I'm generally supportive of this, and I would want it to be kept kind of I say sacred, but just kept specifically for public purposes only, not I wouldn't want to use something like this to start to get commercial, or promote specific businesses, because I think that puts us down a road that's very difficult to control and potentially offends more than it helps.
Mr. Strachan?
Just a couple of thoughts. If the council were to consider an appropriation in 2 weeks, we would need to be able to identify the source of that, because in about 3 or 4 days, we have to notice the appropriation in 2 weeks. We have to give 10 days notice. And so we'd want to know what the source of that is, whether it was from a general fund or from the legacy fund or whatever. So without a motion today to bring back an appropriation for your consideration on the 21st, we probably don't have enough time to get that before the 21st. The next meeting after that is the 12th of October. And at the moment, we don't have a motion to bring anything forward, neither for the appropriation nor the idea of a policy. So I just wanted to put those out there in your thinking. And we have about 10 minutes until a time certain event on your calendar.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Strachan. Mr. Hanley?
Well, for the sake of moving things along, I would move that we appropriate the funds for this from the general fund, but maybe with the caveat that we can explore the possibility of the legacy funds or some other revenue source to replace it. I'm worried about the timing. I do feel that it's not the right time now to completely reinvent what we're going to do with that space. I think Mr. Harding's concerns about it being a public gathering space maybe could be considered, because it doesn't sound like it's theoretically or maybe practically incompatible to have the water feature and use that space for public gatherings. I think that would be my preference, but I don't want to reinvent everything at this point. I want to be able to facilitate this going forward, and so that would be my motion.
And can we just get a little clarification on that? So would your motion include scheduling an agenda item for the 21st to consider an appropriation?
Yes.
And I guess we'll need an amount on that, right, Mr. Strachan? So is 400,000 the number that would be needed? Just want to triple check that. So would that be?
That's what I was proposing, yes,
Okay.
400,000.
Specific about the general fund then, rather than the legacy?
Well, I think that probably deserves more conversation than we have in the next 7 minutes. So that's why I was kind of moving that forward. It seems to me, unless I'm wrong, we would have that option of.
Yeah, I think the question we don't know is whether or not there's $400,000 in excess sales tax funds to be able to move that forward. When leadership had talked about this and we put it on the agenda, the thinking was that the funding would come from the legacy CIP fund in the absence of some other funding source that might come forward. So at the end of the day, at some point they need a by end of the month, they need some kind of indication that, yes, they were going to go ahead with the art project and here's the funding, or it probably doesn't do us well to not have a funding source for the appropriation.
Looks like Mr. Jones has a comment here, and those are often helpful. So let's hear from him now.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think Cliff's point is really well taken about the fact that ultimately a funding source has to be identified. I don't know that that's really necessary today. I think that normally the council here is being asked if there is generally support for the idea of appropriating money for this. Certainly the administration can identify a proposed source that they would bring to you with their appropriation resolution. And they would, because as Ms. Strachan mentioned, it needs to be noticed. But amendments can be made to that as well. So I think at this point, I don't know that we need to spend a lot of time trying to choose the funding source for them, unless the council is of the opinion that there's only one funding source that's acceptable to them.
Thank you, Mr. Jones.
Could I just add a thought to my motion? I mean, yeah, that was kind of the spirit of what I was trying to do. I would imagine another potential source other than the legacy fund, and I don't know if it's even practical, but if we were to be looking at the percent for arts program and there was a way to recover some of these costs through that might happen down the road, that would be I don't know if that's possible, but that could be another route. I'm just wanting to move this forward and knowing that we could have a few options, either sales revenue, legacy, or a percent for arts program, or a combination thereof. But we may have to decide that, it sounds like, within pretty short order.
When would we have to decide that, Mr. Jones? Is that something that would have to be decided before it was noticed, or could it be decided later?
Well, I think that, noticing generally is putting the public on notice that a topic is under discussion. I don't know, I'd have to double check. I don't know that a noticing that proposes a specific source or proposes no source and just says an appropriation is fatally flawed in and of itself. We can certainly investigate that. I would think that at a minimum, we could craft the notice so that it suggests multiple possible sources. So I think there's avenues for us to take as long as the administration has an indication from the council that there's at least a willingness to have this on the agenda in 2 weeks.
Okay, so we have a motion by Mr. Hanley. Mr. Harding?
Yeah, I'd like to second that. And at this point, I think I'm most comfortable with asking for it, at least the default to be considered from the general fund, but very open for proposals on where it ultimately comes from. But it sounds like we really just need to get make that decision that we're going to be doing it from something soon, and then the rest of the details can be worked out. So I'll happily second the motion as it's been worded.
We have a motion and a second. Is there discussion on the motion? Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I just feel like this process may not be totally well vetted. We have not investigated alternatives. And to make this decision this quickly seems hasty. I just did a Google search and it turns out we could buy an art piece from Chihuly for this amount of money. So maybe that's an alternative that should be considered. I just think we ought to do our homework and And if we are going to spend something on such a flashy piece of exterior artwork, then let's get our money's worth and consider the alternatives and show the public that we've done our due diligence.
I'd like to throw out a few thoughts. First of all, as my colleagues have eloquently expressed earlier, I'm also supportive of a Percent for Arts program and agree that we'd have to look at the details because there are quite a few different ways of doing it. And I'm also supportive of saving this particular feature. I do think a lot of due diligence has gone into selecting it. I believe it will be an iconic artistic element and also an iconic element for the entrance to our city and our downtown and our city hall. Is there other discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call for a vote. Let's see, I guess we raise hands in here. All in favor? And then I'll call each of you. Councillor Shipley?
Yes.
Councillor Ellsworth?
No.
Councillor Hoban?
Yes.
Councillor Fillmore?
Yes.
So the motion carries 6-1 with Councillor Ellsworth opposed. Thank you. Let's move on to item number 6, which is a presentation from the Kem C Gardner Institute on diversity in Utah. And this is to be presented by Jennifer Robinson from the Kem Gardner Policy Institute. And is yes.
Well, we didn't vote on the Percent for Arts idea coming back onto an agenda. Do we need to do that?
Leadership would be happy to bring that back.
Okay.
Sorry, I neglected to comment on that. I thought maybe that we should have just a little bit more discussion about that and maybe a staff report on different ways that it could be done and that kind of thing. But plan on that coming back real soon. Thank you. Is Jennifer Robinson available for this presentation? I'm looking to see if she's.
She is. She's in the list here. She's listed as a guest, and when she's ready, she can start speaking and put her face.
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me to join today. We actually have the wrong slide deck up, so I want to just ask how we could correct that. I can share my screen. I sent the slide deck earlier today to your staff.
Yeah, John, we should be able to do you want to just give her, do you have it or do you want her to share hers? Okay, we're just getting it.
Okay, thanks. That'll make it better for all of us, right?
The slide that just got up right now is what I pulled down from your website, so.
That's okay. I updated a few things for you based on the new census numbers. So it's just a little more recent and I think you'll appreciate that and a few more extra things. Before I begin, I just want to say what a lovely city you have. I've spent the last 2 weekends in Provo downtown with my daughter and her friends, and then we had such a great time. We returned last Friday and spent some more time in Provo. Just terrific, beautiful downtown. I was invited to share with you a data book that the Gardner Institute released a few months ago, and it covers diversity in our state. It's really an informative piece, and I don't think there's another thing like that in the state that captures all of this data. So if we could just go to the next slide, I'm going to walk through a few important points that I think will be helpful. The first is the Gardner Institute was asked to do this by business and community leaders, and Zions Bank actually covered the expense for this project. The scope includes race, ethnicity, and sex, men and women in our state, and we're looking at demographics, economics, education, health, and housing outcomes. between those racial ethnic groups and men and women. And the data reveal significant differences or disparities between these groups that I'll walk through. I want to really note that the data are very complex and they're impacted by a variety of factors, and we do not assign causality. I can't tell you why these disparities exist. All I can do is share with you the differences that we see in the data. And I also want to tell you that, as you know, leaders across our state have been making this a priority in our state to better understand. And I really approach this from a place of hope. I think our state is amazing. We have some incredible indicators, and I'll talk about those at the end, around social capital, family stability, income equality, and social mobility that make our state well positioned to make progress and eliminate or reduce the gaps between race ethnicity groups or between men and women on a lot of these points. Next slide, please. I think it's always very helpful to just start and tell you a little bit about who lives in our state. And this is one of those slides that's updated from the earlier slide deck. This is based on the 2020 census data that just came out a few weeks ago. And what you're seeing here is our population broken down by race or ethnicity group. About 75% of Utah's population identify as white, and about 25% of our population identify as ethnic or racial minorities. And you can see those details here. This is a bit of a jump over the last few years. The old data had it at 23% minority, and now we're at 25%. Next slide, please. I also be very happy to answer any questions you have as we're going along. A lot of people claim that Utah is like the least diverse state in the nation, and boy, that's just not the case. So I put up here a slide that shows you all of the states, including Washington, D.C., and the U.S. average. So you can see where we rank in comparison to the other states. Essentially, we're the 34th most diverse state in the nation. We're more diverse than 17 other states, including states like Indiana, Missouri, Ohio, Minnesota, Wisconsin. A lot of people find this to be surprising. And then we have some data from the census on the diversity in some of our counties. San Juan County, not surprising to all of us who live in this beautiful state, is the most diverse. It has the Navajo Reservation down there, one of the four corner counties. I don't have all the city data there, but the city data I just got from our demographer says that Provo, that your minority population is 29% of your city's population. So I thought that might be helpful. Next slide, please. This just shows it a little bit more broken down so you can see all of those states that are less diverse than our own. And then I think the next slide will be helpful to you as well. It's going to show you how we have seen our population change over time. So in here you see two lines. The gray line represents the United States population and the minority share. And in the red line, you can see the Utah population and the minority share of our population and how that's changed over 100 years. The part that's not shaded in the white part is our projections. The Gardner Institute does the projections for our state. We're the state data center for the U.S. Census Bureau, so we're quite closely tied to their work. And we are able to project how our state's population is going to change. Our latest projections came out a few years ago. They'll be updated next year, I think. But we're projecting by 2060 that the state's population will be 35% minority. And the US population, we project 56% will be minority by 2060. All right, next slide. I think it's really helpful just to point out to everybody how complex the data is that we have in the data book. You all can have a copy of it. I can send those hard copies, or you can get a PDF online at the Gardner Institute's website. But this slide I'm going to show you two slides here about the percent of Utah adults that have a bachelor's degree or higher. And what you can see here is a little difference here, about 4 percentage points between men and women in our state. Really interesting, but we break the data down. So on the next slide, you can see how some of these disparities really flip-flop as with age. So if you look here, our 18 to 24-year-old population, there 10% of women in that age group have a bachelor's degree, 3.5% of men. Pretty good size difference there. The 24 to 34-year-old population, you continue to see women outpacing men in the completion of a bachelor's degree. And then evens out a little bit. And then by the 65 plus population, which is my mom and dad's population, you see men far outpacing women in completion of bachelor's degree. I put these two slides up there really to illustrate how complex the data can be and how important it is that we try to present data completely and comprehensively for you all. And you'll notice that if you go through the data book that we're doing as much as we can to break the data down to give you a full understanding of where disparities might exist. I thought it would be helpful if we just cover some of the data that's in our book that goes through the economy, education, healthcare, and housing. So the first is we're going to start with economics in our state. And next slide, please. And I just wanted to show you the population in our state that lives in poverty. This data comes from the Census Bureau's American Community Survey estimates. We used 4 years of data so that we had a large enough sample that we could say something about it. About 9% of Utah's population lives in poverty. You can see a little difference between men and women. And then you see a pretty significant difference when we start looking at racial and ethnic groups in our state, with American Indians and African Americans having a much higher rate of poverty. The next slide is going to keep going on some economic data. The book has much more, but I'm just giving you a little preview here. This is our median household income in our state. The red is covering households. So you could think of that as a family with maybe grandparents or aunts, uncles living there. A family that would just be a pretty basic family like mom, dad, kids. And then non-family you could think of as roommates. And you can see in our population household, median income is about $71,000. And then you can see how it's broken down by those racial and ethnic groups, and that there are some disparities that start to exist there. Any questions at this point? Or if not, I can move on to the next section. Okay. All right, let's go to the next slide then.
Mr. Harding has a question for you.
Yes, please.
So I was just looking at this graph, and I guess I was assuming that household was kind of the broad term, and that could be made up of both family and non-family.
Yes.
Okay.
That's absolutely fair.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to do education on the next one. I have a few things that I want to show you about student achievement. So we have up here a couple of different measures to look at how well our students are doing. Third grade literacy rates, English language art proficiency, mathematics proficiency, their score on an ACT, and in this case, scoring at least an 18 on that ACT, and then high school graduation rates. You can see some disparities here between American Indians, African Americans, Hispanics, Pacific Islanders, and then our Asian and white populations that tend to do significantly better on these proficiencies. And I'll just pause so you can take a moment to look at those. I have one more graphic for education on the next slide that's going to cover educational attainment by race and ethnicity. And I think if you could scroll down just a titch more, there we go. On the red, we are covering bachelor's degree or higher degree, and then the gray is the completion of a high school degree or higher. So in our state, about 92% of our population has completed a high school degree or higher, and about 34% of our population has a bachelor's degree or higher. And then you can see as we work our way down some of the disparities that start to exist. For example, for Hispanic and Latinos in our state, about 71% have a high school degree or higher. About 80% of American Indian or Alaskan Native have a high school degree or higher, about 87% for African Americans. And more data, of course, again, in the data book for you to look at on educational attainment. I think our next slides are going to cover healthcare, and then we're going to do housing at the very end. We have yeah, please.
Question? I'm sorry. I raised my hand, but you probably don't see that.
It's really hard for me. You guys are like postage stamps on my screen.
No, you're doing great. I was curious about the top line on the educational slide, just the prior one.
Yeah.
Looking at Utah there and the totals there, how do we compare to other states?
Oh, I actually don't know off the top of my hand, but I'm happy to find it out and send it to your staff.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm just going to jot a little note down. Okay. So I have two healthcare slides that I wanted to share with you. This is life expectancy. On average, how long are people going to live? And the US average is almost 79 years, and the Utah average is just a titch higher than that at about 80 years. You guys might find this interesting, but women in our state, on average, live about 3 years longer than men, 3.5 years longer than men in our state. And then we have some disparities by racial and ethnic groups as well. I don't know if that's surprising to you, but I always think it's really interesting when we see some differences on health outcomes between men and women. So this is one of those places. And then the next one is going to cover infant mortality. So this is the death of a child under 1 year of age per 1,000 live births. The US average is 5.7 children, and the Utah average is 5.4 children. For whites, it's a little bit lower. For other racial ethnic groups, it's quite a bit higher. So another indicator that shows some disparities between racial groups here. And then lastly, housing. Oh my goodness, housing is really the topic of the day. Oh, I should do this one too. Sorry, I forgot that we're going to show you the depression rates too. This is depression. And it's looking at the percent of adults who identify as having depression. You can see a pretty significant difference between men and women in our state. About 29% of women in our state have said that they have depression, 16.5% of men, and then some differences with racial and ethnic groups exist as well. Really important topic of the day right now, isn't it? And this data comes from the Department of Health, and it's their BRFSS survey that they do annually. If you're interested in this, that BRFSS survey is done nationally. Same questions are done in each state, so it's comparable too, if you'd like that. And then we'll talk about housing. So, wow, housing is really what an issue we have going right now. I visited with somebody on our team who is a housing expert, and he said, Jenny, this is probably the unhealthiest housing market in my lifetime. And there's a lot of reasons for that. You guys are all probably familiar, but issues of supply, demand, the low interest rates, and really incredibly rising housing prices right now. Our state's population has grown at 18.4%. Between 2010 and 2020, that's significant growth, much higher than the national rate, which was, I think, about 7.5%. Our median home prices in our state have increased pretty significantly. In July this summer, the median home price in the state was $455,000, and that's an increase of 28% from the previous July. That's a pretty significant increase. I joke a little bit about it. It's not terribly funny, but I didn't have a 28% salary increase. I don't know who did, but it's a significant increase in the housing market right now. And it's not just along the Wasatch Front. I know Jim Wood from our team will be speaking with you in the coming weeks about housing. This is really happening all along the state. In fact, they told me that Washington County's median home price is now higher than Salt Lake County's median home price. those are some interesting little tidbits, right? I wanted to show you a couple of housing pieces that show some disparities between our racial groups here. This is housing tenure, and what you're seeing in the gray is people living in owner-occupied homes, or in the red, the renter-occupied. About 75 or 70% of people live in owner-occupied in our state. About 74% of whites live in owner-occupied. Then you go to the very bottom of that graph, about 29% of Blacks live in owner-occupied, about 52% of American Indians, about 60% of Asians. Again, people ask me often when I do this, what's the cause of that? Can you give us more detail? And I don't have any great insight into this, but I think Jim will share more with you when he's with you in a couple of weeks. And then the next slide is going to talk about if somebody's cost burdened. Severe cost burden means that they're paying 50% or more of your income for housing. And this is looking at renters. So renters who are paying at least 50% of their income for housing. In Utah, about 18.5%, 18.6% of Utahns are paying at least half their income for rent. That's pretty severe. Whites at 17%, but you see some higher numbers for our other racial and ethnic groups. About 32% of Blacks that are renters are paying at least half of their income for their rent. Pretty significant. The last couple things I wanted to share are just kind of hopeful comments, some incredible strengths in our beautiful state. One is social capital. I don't know if that's a term that gets used very often outside of, campuses, but this comes from the Joint Economic Committee, which is part of the U.S. Congress. Senator Mike Lee led this committee for a while when they were doing social capital work. Social capital you think of as like the glue that keeps society together, keeps people working really well together, and helps you really work through challenging problems in your community. And it's made up of a number of factors. I think the Joint Economic Committee had several dozen factors, but you could boil it down to things like goodwill and fellowship that exists within your community, civic virtue, the effectiveness of your government institutions or other non-government institutions, having networks of trust, that there's a lot of mutual support and cooperation that exists in a community. And I don't think anybody on the call would be surprised, but the state of Utah ranks #1 in social capital in comparison to all of the other states. And I think it's because we have a lot of those incredibly good components. The next slide will show a few more things about why we're such a great state, but income equality, this is on a scale of 0 to 1. Closer to 0 means you have complete income equality, and Utah has the most income equality. We put up here just the top 10 states. And then the next slide covers, I think, mobility, family stability. So this is the percentage of children that live in single parent families. We know the value of that. About 19% of our kids in our state live in single parent families. And then the last slide should cover economic mobility.
We have a question for Mr. Stratton.
Yeah, please.
Jennifer, can you go back to the last slide?
Yeah.
In income equality in what context? Because we're not talking about wage gaps between men and women here. What are we talking about?
No, it's really about how income is dispersed across your population. So if it was a 1, income would be held like with one person essentially. And if it's a 0, it means income is equally distributed across the population. So it signals like things like strong middle class. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. And then the very next one after family stability talks about economic mobility. And this is the idea that one generation can do better than the next generation, move up, you might think of it. So Salt Lake City is ranked in the country as having the most economic mobility, that my children will do better economically than my husband and I have done. And the Salt Lake City zone covers more than just Salt Lake City. It's covering, I think, 4 or 5 counties in our state. This work is done by Ray Chetty, and you guys might have heard of him. He's with Harvard University and does just terrific work. I think the last slide is just going to show you the Gardner Institute's website, where you can go and you can download a copy of the data book and just use it at your leisure, review it. And I'm happy to visit if people have any other questions, or you can send me a question at another time and I'll do my best to answer it. That's what I wanted to cover today. I hope it was helpful to everybody. Glad to stay on for a minute or two if you have questions too.
Mr. Fillmore.
Yes, would you please give me your name again?
Sure, Jennifer Robinson.
Okay, Jennifer, do you have a number we can call you on?
Yeah, I'll actually give you my cell number. So it's 801.
We might want to do that. We might want to do that offline unless you want everybody that's watching this to have your cell phone.
Yeah, Jennifer, send it to me. This is Cliff Strachan.
Okay, Cliff, I'll do that. Thanks for the warning. I didn't know who all was on the call.
Yeah, Jennifer, thank you. This presentation has been very enlightening. Really, a lot of food for thought. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Appreciate that, Counselor. Well, it's been nice to visit with you. Thank you for such a lovely city. I look forward to visiting in your city again and appreciate it, and feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to visit.
Thank you for this very interesting and informative presentation. Mr. Strachan.
So Jennifer, thank you again. We appreciate you coming out and helping us. Jennifer is the first of 3 speakers we'll have over the next 3 consecutive meetings from the Gardner Institute. The next one, Jim Wood is going to come talk to us about affordable housing. And then on October 12th, Natalie Gochner is going to come talk to us, I'll short form it, but about social capital.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. It's now time for our scheduled break. So we're actually a little bit ahead of schedule. So if we break for, let's say 12 minutes, come back at 2:40. We'll see y'all then.
Recording stopped. Recording in progress.
Okay, we'd like to resume our meeting and move on to item number 7, which is a discussion regarding the floodplain maps and the levee plan for the west side of Provo City. This item is to be presented by Dave Decker, Public Works Director. And after our discussion last time, we're sure looking forward to any enlightenment and direction you can give us on this.
Thank you, Chair Sewell. And I'm hopeful that I can add some clarification and maybe make some recommendations as far as moving steps to move forward on this. I know when we made this presentation in July, we ran out of time and weren't able to finish the last 4 or 5 slides, which I think contains some recommendations, and that's my intent today to go through that information with you. I also let's see if this will work. Yeah. I also wanted to, before we get into too many details on the flood issue, particularly on the west side of Provo, I want to make sure that the council knows we've got a number of staff members on the call. So if there's any technical questions, and I've also got a number of staff members and a member of the consulting team from CRS here today also. So if there's specific questions that you'd like to ask, I think we've got enough people here that we should be able to answer the questions that you may have. I felt like we wanted to start with some clarification. This map was shown on one of the slides, and it was cut in half. Essentially, there was 2 maps that were shown on the same slide, and I think it was a little bit difficult for the council to kind of orient themselves with the west side. And so I asked the staff to put this map on a single slide, and then also to add some explanation on the left-hand side of this slide. And I'm gonna spend quite a bit of time on this so that the council understands exactly the nature of this slide. It represents what we anticipate FEMA will adopt. They have given us every indication that they plan to adopt it. I don't think it's formally adopted yet, but they're going through all the right steps to formally adopt this map. And I think it's important also to remember that this map represents really 2 different floods. One, what we call the Utah Lake flood, or a rising Utah Lake that comes into the city from Utah Lake. The other flood is from the river, the Provo River, and it's coming down from Deer Creek, or the natural channels from the upper Provo, and coming down through the northeast corner of the city, and then across I-15 and into the west side. And so even though we represent all the floodplain on one map here, it really represents potentially 2 different issues, 2 different events that may or may not happen at the same time. I also wanted to talk a little bit about the color coding, or the hatching that's on this map, and just talk a little bit about the numbers that are impacted. So I'm going to start at the top on the left-hand side, which involves the Utah Lake flooding, and it's the lightest blue. It's the largest area that's mostly from the lower left-hand side, and it kind of works its way through about half the map diagonally across the west side of Provo. And for clarification, this flood, a potential flood event, impacts less than about 25 homes right now that exist on the west side of Provo. So we tried to go through and find out exactly how many homes are in the current floodplain. And the reason that we say that is that elevation, that 4498 that's noted in that area, we are requiring new homes to build above that, at least a foot above that elevation. And that includes their basements. So many of the newer subdivisions that you can picture on the west side, part of the reason that we're elevating those homes, it's in part because of this flood issue right here. So some of the older homes are obviously built below that elevation, but all the newer homes that have recently and will go forward, in the future being built in this area, they're going to be built above that elevation. So I think that's important to understand when you look at that hatching on the west side. The next one down, I'm going to call it the dark blue side hatching. It's in fact the next couple. In fact, I think all of them from this point down involve the other event, the river flooding, and the darker blue that's zone AE. It requires flood insurance if they're built below the base flood elevation. And we've noted there's about 162 homes thereabouts in Provo right now that are in that zone. And they're the ones that are primarily going to be affected. And then the next area down, the one that's in the green, the lighter green, there's about 74 homes in that area. And then in the I'll call it salmon color, the darker pink, there's about 15 homes in that particular area. I think it's also important to the next one down to note the hatching. And I think we probably gave the impression to the council, the wrong impression in the first presentation, that this hatched area, it's zone X, would require flood insurance, and they do not require flood insurance. They have less than 1 foot in that hatching area. And then in the bottom one, the yellow, there's no flood insurance required in that, just because of the low chance that the homes have in that area. So the ones that are primarily affected are those three that I mentioned in the river. And then we feel like going forward, particularly new subdivisions on the west side being built above that elevation, we'll be protecting newer homes. So I hope that clarifies a little bit of the issues that we maybe instigated, I guess, with the first presentation. Let me go to the next slide and try to help the council understand exactly what we're talking about. And again, I'm hoping by the end of this presentation, a few of these topics will come together and make some sense why I'm going through some of these details. In the first presentation, we talked about a river flood and really didn't give.
Excuse me, Councilor Shipley has a question for you before you get too far.
That's fine.
Sorry, just on that previous slide, you had mentioned a certain amount of households on one of the, like, I don't remember if it was the light blue or the dark blue, like 48 households. And I was trying to take notes on how many households we project at this point would require homeowners insurance. And I just wonder if we have a number estimate at this point.
So right now, the numbers that I have right now, we have about 25. In fact, it's less than 25 in the light blue. There's about 162 in the dark blue. And then there's 74 in the light green and 15 in what I'll call the pink or the salmon color.
We're talking about approximately 300 households. 300 houses?
In rough terms, yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. And I'll come back and try to address that. And in the recommendations, there's some, there's in our recommendations, there's probably some ways to reduce the number of homes that potentially would require flood insurance. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. So the next slide that I wanted to talk about and help the council understand is we talked about a river flood and really didn't give the council a number. And I apologize. I know engineers oftentimes use acronyms or numbers that really don't make a lot of sense. But generally, when we talk in flood terms, we talk about cubic feet per second. That's CFS. And so the table along the top, and well, both tables actually are in numbers of CFS. Cubic feet per second. And more than the numbers, I think it's important for the council to understand when we talk about a 100-year event, and by the way, I don't like it when we talk about 100-year events. A lot of people think about, oh, that's only going to happen once a year. It's actually not. That is a falsehood that I think the title kind of inherits when we use that acronym. It's actually a percent likelihood that it's going to happen. And and it's a guaranteed it's a guaranteed number that will happen within every 100 years, but there's actually a chance every single year that will happen. And in fact, many times 100-year events. In fact, we had a rainfall that went through the Grandview area 1st of August, I believe, this year. Again, very, very high intensity. People that have been around for less than 8 or 9 years, remember only 8 or 9 years ago, we had another event just about the same intensity. Both of them were in excess of a 50-year event. And people will look at you and say, well, why do we have two 50-year events that are 8 or 9 years apart? And that's just the statistics. And I've got some great textbooks. If you're ever struggling to sleep at night, I can guarantee you I've got a textbook on engineering statistics that'll put you to sleep. So, but I think it's important to understand from the numbers that we're not talking about some magical event that has never happened. The number that the FEMA group decided, and I think it's important to understand how they decided on this number, is 2,325 cubic feet per second. And part of the reason that they decided on that number was a meeting that they held with the operators of the of the Deer Creek Reservoir. Several staff members, including myself, attended this meeting. And there was a number decided in that meeting. And by doing that, I think in part they admitted a few things about the nature of a flood event. And I'll come back and just talk about that in just a minute here. But I think it's important to note, okay, they're using a number 2325 cubic feet per second. Have we ever seen anything close to that recently? And we actually have. And you can see the events that we've listed. This is off of river gauge data. So this is not staff presentation or estimates. This is actual gauge data on the river. And you can see in 2019, particularly in 2017, only 4 years ago, we had an event that was almost 2,000 cubic feet per second. And so we are getting very, very close to the same type of an event that they are portraying on the river as a 100-year flood event. And I think it's important for the council to note that we have made this point numerous times. We actually wrote a letter. I'll send the letter to the council. I signed a letter basically saying that I disagree with a lot of their approaches, primarily because we've had events. We've had multiple events. We've had the levees there for 40 plus years, about 40 years since the levees have been built. And by and large, they've operated just fine. And it's not like we've never had an event that approximates the flood event that they're talking about in their mapping process. We're getting pretty darn close to the same event in 2017. And so I guess that's point number one. I think it's important for the council to know that we have seen very, very similar events to what we're talking about on the mapping. The other thing that I would point out with these numbers to the council, and I'm gonna apologize right out of the gate right now because I'm gonna veer off the main topic a bit here and talk a little bit about how ASR may play into this. I think it's important to note that the overall flood events that we have in Provo are largely man-made. And by saying that, what I'm meaning is that there is a decision made upstream from the river, on the river, to release a certain quantity of water. And that's primarily happening at Deer Creek Reservoir. And if you think about the philosophy and the reason that Deer Creek Reservoir is there, it's primarily about drinking water. And the objective, the main goal of having Deer Creek there is to make sure that that reservoir is full by the time spring runoff ends. And there's lots of factors. The agency that runs that river, they have tried to be sensitive to our request to be careful about what flood events they're creating downstream. And you can see in 2017 and 2019, you can see it decreased a little bit in 2019 based on our request, but not a lot. And let me help the council understand what generally happens in spring runoff so that you can understand why I'm saying, those flood events are largely man-made, because They're looking at hydrology, they're looking at snowpack, they're looking at weather forecasts, they're looking at lots of different factors and basically trying to do their best job in saying, we're going to start releasing water at a certain period of time, knowing that we're going to get a certain quantity into the reservoir, but we're still going to try to get that reservoir completely full. When that water stops in the spring runoff, we want that reservoir completely full. And so generally, they do not start releasing water until a couple of weeks before spring runoff really starts naturally upstream from those reservoirs. And what that usually constitutes, if we get large quantities of water into the reservoir, they have to release large quantities out of the reservoir. If they don't have the storage to fill the reservoir, they're going to release most of the water downstream, and that's what generates the flood events for us. You can think about it, though, in terms of if that was not the goal, if it was a different approach with that reservoir and they had a little bit more capacity in the reservoir for that spring runoff, and they started the release early in the spring, instead of a couple of weeks early, they could start a couple of months early, or they could let the same quantity of water out, but at a much slower rate, 500-600 CFS, which the river could easily handle, and not create the flood events, and we would not have the risk downstream from the reservoir. And so the point that I'm trying to make is the surface water, the purpose of the surface water is largely dictating and now impacting flood events someplace else. So I guess the point that I'm trying to make is if the drinking water, the agencies that had the drinking water had the ability to store that water someplace else, and hence the tie to ASR, if they had the ability to store it in the ground or someplace else, to create a little bit more space in that reservoir, it would be a protection measure for flood events downstream. And that's certainly not the main reason that we're doing ASR, but it's one of the benefits. And I guess I'm trying to help the council understand, instead of looking at drinking water in just terms of surface water, if you look at it holistically and understand drinking water or the water system holistically, it helps to alleviate some of the problems that we create by man-made systems, please.
Just a quick question. I've read that sometimes dams release in shorter periods of time because they actually want to mimic a flood condition, obviously not the extreme flood condition, but if they release the water slowly and steadily all the time, then it's sort of bad for the river ecology, right? They have to sort of pretend that there's not a dam there so that it still ebbs and flows a little bit more like a natural river. Is that informing part of their decision?
So I hear the same thing, particularly on the Colorado River. You see that talked about quite a bit, particularly the sediment and some of the aquatic life actually need that flood event. But it's interesting. It's interesting that you bring this up, because I've done a little bit of research on the Provo River, and I found two studies done by the USGS, and one was dated 1905, one was dated 1911. So both of them were done before either Deer Creek or Jordanelle were on the Provo River. Neither year did they have anything that approximated the flood events that are shown right here. The top flood event in, again, a pretty natural setting was about 1,200 CFS, so significantly less. And so I guess my point the way that I would answer is, yes, I think it's still important to have those flood events for sediment and other purposes, but probably not at the same level that you're seeing out of a man-made structure.
Councilor Shipley.
And just to follow up on this, and maybe I just don't understand how Deer Creek works, but I'm understanding you to say that they basically control our river flooding potential. And is there any other outlet for them? Is there any other contingency for them other than our river to release pressure? I mean, is that something they plan for? Is some other way to release pressure instead of just putting it all on us and causing potentially this flooding at some point?
So the concept that I'm throwing out, and again, it's going to take some time to have this conversation. I think the conversation about groundwater in general is just starting to kind of mature in Utah. You see ASR getting a little bit more attention. There's about a half a dozen ASR sites active right now in the state of Utah. None in Utah County. There's, I think, one in Salt Lake County. But they're just not that common. And to answer the second part of your question, really, there's not another outlet. There's not another river. There's not another place that, naturally can take the quantity of water that we're talking about. Just to give you a little bit of perspective, again, the quantity of water that we're talking about, people say, well, why can't you treat it and drink it or store it or something like that? Well, the treatment plant that Central Utah Water operates in Orem, the maximum flow that they can take out of the river is 150 CFS. It's less than 10% of the flow that we're talking about. So and the water quality would be such that it would be difficult to treat anyway. Demand is relatively low also at that point of the year. So there's not a place, at least, a man-made place that you can put that kind of quantity of water. And really, you can't even get 23, 25, more than 2,000 CFS into the ground. ASR is a very, very, relatively slow process. And so you'd have to plan, you'd have to be thinking in terms, you'd have to change your philosophy about surface water and groundwater and how they interact. You'd really have to rethink the reservoir.
Thank you. Just as a quick follow-up, as a reference point for me, what's the proposed water treatment plant? Our proposed water treatment plant, how much CFS would it take on?
So it's only a 20 MGD treatment plant. The Orem treatment plant, the Central runs, is 100 MGD. So it's a fifth of Ryan can run the 150. What's 20% of 150? It's not very many. It's not very much CFS. 30 CFS.
Councilor Fillmore. Councilor Fillmore, did you have a comment? You're muted.
Yes, I do. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Decker, I want to follow up on Mr. Shipley's question, make sure I understand this correctly. I'll put it as succinctly as I can. The potential flood potential in our river is largely, if not entirely, a function of decisions being made in connection with Deer Creek Dam, over which we have absolutely no control. That's question number one. Is that right?
Yes.
Question number two is, most of the water in Deer Creek eventually is headed up north, right? To satisfy culinary water needs of our neighbors to the north.
That's correct.
And so we are going to have a federal one-size-fits-all program compel us to spend a lot of money on insurance or otherwise, insurance or improved levies or something, to cure a problem over which we have no control. And it seems patently unfair to me. Can you comment on that?
Well, I think I'm going to try to address that as I get a little bit further into my presentation. I'm headed that direction.
Okay, I'll wait.
Okay. If I don't answer the question, let me know toward the end of the presentation, and I'll make sure that I get back to that. So let me just go to the end of the presentation that we made in July and try to answer a few questions. This is just a reminder of the alternatives that CRS recommended to the council. Just a reminder, alternative 2A is the recommended alternative that they're looking at. I bring this up to make sure that the council understands the consulting team looked at other alternatives. This was not the only thing that they looked at. So one of the things that, in my experience about flood control, some of the other things that I've seen, particularly in Davis County, where I worked for earlier in my career, If you've ever driven through Bountiful City, you'll note that most of their channels are concrete lined, or they have concrete walls on the side, and those are mostly flood control measures to try to control the water. And so I asked CRS, did we consider those type of things? And they said, yes, absolutely. In the existing levee system, we have another alternative. If you can picture, if you've ever walked along the levees, those levees could potentially be dug. So you can think of a track hoe on those levees, digging a very deep channel right down the middle of the levee and filling it with concrete. There's a way that could be done and still act as a flood control feature and really leave the levee largely in place. Now, the vegetation probably would be damaged to the point where you'd lose a lot of the vegetation, but some of the vegetation could be put back in place. But my question to CRS was, when we considered those items, why weren't they included in the list of alternatives to the council? And mostly because of the cost. You can imagine, particularly flood walls and lining the Provo River, that's not very appealing, but it's also very, very costly for a contractor to do that. And even to dig in the levee and put a wall inside the existing levee, it would be very, very costly, more so than just replacing the levees that they've recommended. But I think it's important for the council to note, we did consider other alternatives in this process. I also had questions from the council about federal actions that were taken. The consulting team and our staff mentioned that during this process, there's been a couple of times where we or other people have said, hey, this doesn't seem exactly fair. This seems like a East Coast, West Coast issue. Is this really making sense for particularly the Western United States? And I think it's important to note that in early 2000, they kind of called a timeout, let the federal Congress review and look at this. But I will note that it really didn't answer the questions that we have largely in the Western United States. And it's mostly because of the nature, particularly in Provo, the nature of the levies. There's so many items. If you remember in the first presentation, Ben went through a number of checklists. There was a dozen or so different criteria to have a certified levy. And I think we met two of them in one case. And so the levy system it's not like we're close here. We're quite a ways off the target. But I think it's important to note that they really didn't answer or ask that question. This was really more about alleviating or limiting the amount of damage. And you can see, by who challenged it, primarily in Arkansas, Illinois, Mississippi. It was mostly about the Midwestern United States, challenging some of the issues there. So moving forward, let me make some recommendations moving forward here. So here's some options that we are looking at and considering and presenting to the council today. We can go back and ask for additional congressional review. We can approach federal officials. We've got good contacts. The pros and cons on this, you can read through them, but I think it's important to note the likelihood of having, significant changes in particularly the certification for a levy. I think it's pretty low. I think we're going to be running up a pretty difficult road in that particular challenge there. The next item that we're recommending, and this is actually one of the recommendations, is for Provo City to do its own study particularly on the Provo River, not necessarily on the Utah Lake side, but the Provo River side has some options. And I've mentioned one of them relative to a different operation on the Deer Creek Reservoir. I think some of the technical areas of the levee system could be looked at a little bit differently, and the likelihood of changing the depth of the flood. And you'll notice in that map that I spent quite a bit of time at the first part of this presentation, they had different flooding elevations. That's really critical. And by changing the CFS, even by 100 or 200 CFS, it's going to change the flood, that map potentially significantly. And even if it's eliminating, 100 homes from it, it's probably worth studying and doing our own study. So this is one of the recommendations that we are giving to the council and to the administration to move forward is for the city to do its own study on the Provo River floodplain. And then certifying the lake levee reconstruction. This is, again, this is one of the recommendations that we're making moving forward. It is a significant cost. However, the lake levees themselves, not the Provo River, but the lake itself is about 15 million. So out of the 50 million right here, 54 million construction cost, total construction cost, I guess it's 51 million. 15 of that could be solved on the Utah Lake side. So really we're recommending a two-part approach to the council here. One, restudy the riverside floodplain, and then approach FEMA and other potential federal agencies for money to rebuild the lakeside levees in Provo River. And that cost is about $15 to $16 million. So that's really the recommendations that we have. Let me just remind you, and again, this is in here just for reminder on the riverside and the alternative 2A. Part of the reason that the cost is high is because we end up taking homes to build the levee that's set back from the river. So again, that's part of the high cost. This is a picture of the levee that's around the airport. It does not include the entire lake levee. So that lake levee does continue along to the east and partway up the river. But that is what we're recommending to rebuild. And our staff is already starting preparations for applications to FEMA and to a number of other federal agencies and state agencies. And in the next 12 to 24 months, we anticipate that we'll submit probably a half a dozen different applications for money, funding to rebuild the lakeside levees. That's where we'll focus initially with that funding. And then we'll also move forward on a parallel track with the consulting team to restudy the river and primarily present an alternate view of the river for the state and the federal agencies to consider. So that's the recommendation moving forward that we have for the council at this point. So I wanted to leave enough time for any other questions, and I'm hoping, Mr. Fillmore, I think you had the question. I'm hoping that presentation answered your question about steps moving forward.
Well, frankly, Mr. Decker, it gave me more information, but it's not terribly satisfying answer. And I know that to some extent your hands are tied. You don't control the situation. But it still seems to me that we're in a situation where most of the benefit from loading up Deer Creek in the spring for a faster release, where most of the water does not benefit Provo directly but goes north, and we're being asked to bear the brunt of the expense of a fairly remote risk and having this uniform straitjacket put on us, demanding either insurance or paying for levies. That just, it seems out of whack that in terms of the benefits and the risks and the costs, that we're being imposed upon to absorb the risk and the cost for the benefit of really other people who will be receiving the water. That doesn't make sense to me.
So let me expand a little bit about the scope that we intend when I talk about restudying and submitting a different study on the Provo River to FEMA, both on the state and the federal level. One of the things that we will explore with that is exactly what I'm talking about, changing the operation, the nature of Deer Creek Reservoir. It will take some work. That is not a given. And as I mentioned, it really takes a change in thought about drinking water and surface water and how it's managed. And there's no guarantee. I'm not going to stand here and tell you that that's going to happen. It's almost 100 years old now, that reservoir, and it's largely been operated as a drinking water surface supply. And you're correct. Most of it goes to Salt Lake County, and Provo does get some. We get through the Metropolitan Water Board, we get about 8,000 acre feet, but it's a very small quantity. And you're right, it's going to take some doing to actually affect a change in the operation. But I think it's a relatively important conversation to start to have. It's part of the reason that we've started in Provo to have that same conversation about ASR, because it's a different approach. It's a holistic approach. It's about not putting all your eggs in one basket as far as your water supply, your drinking water supply. And most of what dominates in, not just in Utah, it's not just about Deer Creek, it's about the Western United States. It's about surface water. Every time we talk about drinking water, it's generally about surface water. Pictures that are shown about droughts and things like that. It's all about reservoirs and the levels of the reservoirs, and yet there's very little conversation about groundwater. And really, that's where most of a much larger quantity of water can be stored naturally. And again, that's part of the reason that the staff has made. The point to the council here is that we need to start thinking about groundwater and making sure that that's a long-term sustainable supply. So you're right. It's probably not, I can't give you a better answer, but all I'm telling you is staff and as elected officials, this is one of the areas that the council and the administration probably can help us a little bit in contacting people that serve on the board at the Provo River Water Users Association. That's who operates Deer Creek Reservoir, and to try to help them understand the importance of changing that approach on the operation of the reservoir.
Well, David, I really do appreciate how deep you've gone on this. I greatly appreciate your attempt here in the future to take a holistic approach. And hopefully that meets with some people who are willing to listen and be fair. Just a couple of questions. The 8,000 cubic feet, acre feet, 8,000 acre feet that were allocated is what percentage of the total flow out of the reservoir?
So I believe the total storage, annual storage is 150,000 acre feet, and we get 8,000 acre feet. So it's about, what is that, about 5%? 5 or
6% is all. Second thing is, we did get some information a while back about some necessary repairs at Deer Creek Dam. What's the status on that?
So they are moving forward with that project. They have a couple of projects planned. They have 2 valves that they are still working to replace. They had a couple of valves, and I think one of them was faulty, and I think they're working through replacing that valve. The other major project that they have at Deer Creek is the outlet tower that they are going to build. And I do not know the status of that project, but I know it is relatively near term. I think they're planning to do that in the next, probably in the next 5, certainly the next 10 years.
Okay, thank you. One last question. A few weeks ago, the council received an inquiry from a former member of the city council asking if any serious thought had been given to the concept of establishing a special services district for homes in residential areas along the river on both sides. Is that something that your people have seriously considered?
So that is an item that we've talked about just briefly with the administration, and that has not been eliminated. Certainly, that is an option for us to pursue. I would put it down the list, though, a little bit. I would like to pursue some other applications for federal money, whether it's through FEMA, the Bureau of Reclamation. There's a number of sites, and again, we've got about a half a dozen already that we've started. And I think we ought to pursue those options before we, throw a burden, even if it's a long-term burden that a special service district would create. It helps and would flatten out the potential payments, but a special service district still basically has the repayment burden placed upon the citizens that live within that district. And I think, again, I think we ought to pursue some other options before we just go there immediately.
Well, I agree with that. If we can get federal state grants, that would be best. I'm just curious if we've done a deeper analysis on that possibility, but maybe that's kind of a last resort.
Counselor Shipley.
Yeah, just two hopefully quick questions. One is when we talk about a $15 million price tag on the levees, the lakeside levee, can you give us just some perspective on how much the Provo's obligation to that would be? I mean, I know you don't know, but are all these grants that we'd apply for kind of matching grant style, or give us just some concept of what the city liability might be for something like that?
So they all vary. Again, the ideal grant would be some federal agency or state agency that would step in and say, hey, we're going to pay the entire $15 million bill. Most of them, however, have some kind of a matching, and they vary. I've seen as high as 50% match. Some of them are probably down in the 10%. Ben, is that 25? So 25 is probably your typical 25 to 50% match.
Okay, thank you. And another quick question that is still unclear in my mind. So if we restudy if we put in and restudy the river side of things, first of all, what would the time frame be on that? And second of all, how soon do residents have to start paying insurance mandatorily?
Ben, can you give us an idea? How long would a restudy on the river take?
So the process with FEMA for a restudy is you go through the partial map revision process, and usually that process takes 2 years, I would say would be my best guess. We do want to wait though for FEMA to finish their current study before we start our new study, just because we want to make sure theirs is finalized and we know what their results were before we jump in too deep with a new study. So
does the new study delay the requirement for homeowners to pay the flood insurance in the meantime?
No, it would become effective as soon as FEMA's study became effective. So,
and that could be any month now. Is that?
Yeah, January 2024 is about when we think that's going to go effective.
Thank you.
Counselor Hanley.
Yeah, I guess maybe I just want to get a little more clarification about what you're saying about the Deer Creek practices. So, the 2017 and 2019 numbers, did we actually have flooding that the levees were needed for in those years?
Absolutely.
Okay. I'm just curious, don't they have or maybe this is what you're saying the local study could do. Don't they have some sense of what the limit would be at which they would be putting Provo at serious risk if they released beyond that CFS number, whatever it is? I guess my point is, maybe they would say, look, we've got to release more intensely as a general rule. But if they know that the snowpack is really heavy during a particular year, I assume they have ways of estimating how much water they're going to have to release in the spring. And presumably in a really bad winter, they would know in advance, enough in advance that they could release more of the water earlier so that it wouldn't create catastrophic. If there's a point at which we could say, you can't go beyond this amount of CFS unless you anticipate that we're going to have serious property damage.
Yeah, so that meeting that I mentioned, that the state FEMA people came and met with the operators of the dam and several other agencies, Provo was there. That number that just like you said, we kind of know, everybody kind of knows what the levee system along the lower Provo can handle. And it's about 2,200 CFS. And that number was thrown out in that meeting. And the operators of the dam know that if they exceed that flow in the lower Provo, they're going to create a, substantial problem. And in the extreme ends of it, it's fairly easy to predict, the runoff. And hey, yeah, it's really easy if we got a really good snowpack and we've got a really wet spring. It's really easy for a decision maker, at Deer Creek to say, hey, I'm going to start the release early. It looks really, really good. Or on a really dry scale, the drought this year, it's probably going to be really easy to say, hey, we're not going to release any water next spring. Because Deer Creek is so low. But it's the middle years, it's in the middle section that is really, really difficult. If you remember in 1983, we had a decent snowpack most of the wintertime. It only picked up right at the very end of the wintertime. And then really what tipped off the 1983 was a really, really wet spring. And it started raining and it didn't let up. And by that time, it's too late to lower the reservoir at that point. The response needs to be months ahead, not the week or 2 weeks before the spring runoff really starts.
Well, in that case, it seems like it's pretty hard to know that, right? I mean, you can know what the snowpack is, but you don't know what the spring weather is going to bring.
But my point is, in that 1983 year, if you looked at how much water was in the reservoir and said, hey, we're going to build a safety factor in it every single year in those, if we see ourselves in that middle category, in the conditions that I'm talking about, and we say, hey, we might run a risk here. Let's start a month or a month and a half earlier than spring runoff is anticipated and actually build some capacity for flood control in the reservoir. And if we were able to put that in a spot
I see.
Okay. where Salt Lake City still had access to it, again, it's in the ground, it's still stored in the ground. And if Salt Lake City still had access to it, they're not out any drinking water.
Right.
They've just stored it someplace else. And they might actually get more water out of the deal if the spring runoff did turn heavy.
Okay. So, and maybe this has been painfully clear in what you presented, and it just is taking me a while to assimilate all this. But what you're saying is that if they would take our aquifer storage recovery into consideration among the sort of, when you were talking about the local study, I assume that's part of what you're saying as well, right? It's not just the levees and the floodplain. It's also that we have access to greater storage capacity, that it's in our interest that they use so that we don't have to run those risks.
I mean, one of the conversations, let me expand this just a little bit more so that hopefully the council understands. So one of the conversations that probably needs to happen along with the river restudy is to approach other water agencies. Central Utah Water has, recently gotten on board with the ASR approach, and they're looking primarily in North Utah County. Well, many of the outlet structures that go out of Deer Creek go north through northern Utah County into Salt Lake. And there's places that they'll be studying in northern Utah County where they could put water. And it could be Deer Creek water that Salt Lake City owns, or, through their metro district. And so they could temporarily store it there. And again, give 10 or 20,000 acre feet of flood storage in Deer Creek as just a backup. And so it would prevent this really strong 2,300 cubic feet per second flood coming through Provo. You'd still get some flooding, but probably not in the terms that, we're talking about. And again, those by limiting the CFS, it's going to change the floodplain in Provo City. It will make a difference in that map.
Councilor Hardy.
Thank you. I'm grateful you just had that conversation. That was some points that I wanted to make, and it sounds like we're all very clear on how ASR hopefully can go into that equation and can reduce the likelihood of flooding down the lower Provo. I'm also grateful that we talked, the special district was brought up. I really think that we should be looking very carefully at other options. And so I'm glad those are on the table. And maybe I'm missing something here, but from between this presentation and the last presentation, it sounds like we have levies, we have functional levies that, probably don't meet, Mississippi hurricane standards, but are quite functional for what we're doing. And so we're looking at potentially spending $50 million that would only give us, a practical, a small incremental reduction in actual risk. We're not talking about life and safety of the residents of Provo. Really, by doing nothing, what we're looking at is a substantial insurance burden to some. One other idea I heard last time is considering the price tag on what we're looking at. What would be the price tag of just the city paying the flood insurance premiums, the difference, and that's kind of goes counter to how we generally approach things. We generally don't pay people's private insurance, but if we're looking at $50 million of taxpayer money, and we talked about 275 homes. That's $182,000 per house is what we're talking about. And so if we could pay a small fraction of that and just cover the insurance premiums, it seems like the taxpayers would be very far ahead. So I hope we're really exploring the various options. Now, when I look at some of these levee plans and moving the levees further out, and boy, as someone who loves to recreate along the Provo River, so much of our banks are right now exposed chunks of concrete because all the over soil has been washed away, and it's difficult to get down to the river and whatnot. So the idea of having the levees on the outside and having some more gentle slopes, that sounds wonderful to me, but at that cost, I just we just have to make sure that we're making good decisions with the taxpayers' money and really look at all the options. When we look at the river levee, the lake levee, and it's only 15 out of the 40, the 51 that we were looking at. So it's a much smaller chunk of money, but what is the justification for it? If it's for the airport, that's one thing. If it's a justification for the 25 homes, we're talking $600,000 per home. So anyway, I hope we're thinking very broadly and really exploring all of the options of, including the kind of the do nothing option with some mitigation. And anyway, I hope all those options are still on the table.
Any other questions?
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Decker. Difficult problem.
I hope I added some clarification. I'm not 100% sure that I have, but I think it's important for the council. Mr. Harding touched on this just a bit. I think it's important for the council to know this has been very frustrating for the staff because the functionality of the levies, we've experienced it. We're hands on the ground, group by and large, and we know what the levies look like. And a lot of this is, if I can use this term, a little bit of a paper exercise. And it's somewhat difficult for us to understand, even in some of the mapping, the levees are ignored. Sometimes they're not ignored. They actually, in some cases, they create flooding because they have the river, in the river flood, they have the river going through the levee that isn't there. But when it hits the lakeside levees down by the airport, they leave the levees in place. And So it's a little bit, it doesn't seem entirely fair. You know, I've heard that used a couple of times by the council members. And I think it's important to know that we are pushing FEMA and other federal agents, state agencies really, really hard to try to make this more reasonable. And it's partly the reason that we've taken the approach, the recommendation that we're giving to the council. And I think it's the right methodology. And I think it gives us a chance to go back and say, you know, time out, this river is probably not the same river that you guys think it is on a piece of paper, and let's talk about it. So.
Thank you very much, Mr. Decker.
Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Sounds like we'll be talking about this again. We're out of time, need to move on to item number, let's see, we're at item number 8 now, which is a presentation from the Parks Department regarding the application for a country recreation grant for trail safety lighting. And this item is to be presented by Doug Robbins. Welcome, Doug.
Thank you. Today, appreciate the opportunity to present on 2021's Utah County Municipal Recreation Grant. And this year, our proposal will be for the Provo River Trail Safety Lighting Expansion. This is an annual grant opportunity from Utah County to citizens, to cities within the county based on the restaurant tax. Funds are distributed based on population data, and based on our population right now, our grant allocation is $56,796.70. The grant applications are due September 20th, so we're kind of up against the deadline. It's a reimbursement grant, so the city would expend the funds and would submit for reimbursement following installation of these lamps. So some past grant projects include last year's trail enhancement lighting project, where we installed 20 lamps just downriver, starting downriver from Geneva Road all the way through the former KOA property up through the train trestles. And it's really lit up that area nicely. It's really enhanced safety. So that was last year. Years past, we've done dugout and bleacher shade structures at Fort Utah Park, Lakeshore Bridge Trailhead, parking lot improvements at Pioneer Village and the museum, and the Lions Park staircase. The reason for this priority this year, again, is just really, it's all about safety. With larger populations and diverse work schedules, we're finding the use of the trail earlier in the morning and later at night, even after dawn and dusk. So lighting enhances visibility and really expands the capacity of the trail for our trail users that are working longer hours. And it just enables them to utilize that trail in a safer environment. We feel that this grant opportunity is a good one for this grant, for this project, because funds are required to be expended and installed within 5 months. It's a really quick turnaround. So this gives us just enough time with a 12-week turnaround for ordering the lamps to have them delivered and then installed by the deadline in March of next year. We feel that solar is a good option for lighting. Several areas along the trail, we have access to the city power system. Several areas we do not. And rather than trench up through those areas, solar is a great option. It tends to use a little bit lower consumption. So it's a sustainable source. Our panels are rated to last 25 years and the batteries have a lifespan of about 10. So going with the same product, we can, switch out these batteries in unified fashion. These are also directed towards the path surface. They're just not, broadcasting light up into the atmosphere. So it's a relatively low impact. And we just try to light it. Our lighting plan is just enough to light the trail without too much overspray. Here's a couple of photographs, thanks, of some of the lamps that we put in. This is in a pretty heavily vegetated area just downriver from down the river trail from Geneva Road. Really lights that up at night. And then this is in the former KOA property. You can see that they're spaced just enough, but not too close. So what we've learned over the past couple of years with social distancing and other limitations, how important these outdoor spaces are to our residents. So we're very excited to increase the capacity of the trail, continue our lighting from where we left off last year, and hopefully get all the way up to Columbia Lane, which will finish the first phase of the trail improvements that we started probably 3 years ago. So I think you can answer any other questions. If there's no objection, we'd like to proceed with this grant application, get it in by the deadline.
Any questions? Not seeing any objections either. So I think we're with you on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Next item is number 9, an ordinance amending titles 14 and 15. And this item is to be presented by Melissa McNally, planner.
Good afternoon, Council. I'm John Magnus, policy analyst. Last meeting on the August 24th, the council meeting, you passed this ordinance. The title of it was to change titles 14 and 15 for gender references, grammatical, and stylistic purposes. After reviewing it, we found out that there was more than just those 3 things listed. There were some minor substantial changes to it. There was discussion on how we could correct that, go back through, make some changes, pull out the pieces that the Planning Commission hadn't seen. After reviewing all the work in the last week, we found out the Planning Commission had seen most of these things except for 2 sections. It was 14.20, 20C, .200, and .030. Those sections hadn't been seen. So what we came up with is at tonight's meeting to rescind the ordinance that you passed at the last meeting and to consider a new ordinance with a proper title mentioning that there are some substantive changes to it, and to go through that whole process again, where you guys can amend, you can continue it just like a normal item would be, since it would be a new first hearing. Melissa can answer the questions on how those things changed. What we do know is that the Planning Commission heard it November 20th, 2020, and it's taken 9 months to get here. And during that interim time, the employee who was working on it had left. Some miscommunication between the departments, and this is where we are today.
Thank you, John.
Mr.
Harding.
If I may, if there were 2 aspects that were not reviewed by the Planning Commission, are we okay to move forward in approving them, or by law, do they need to be heard by the Planning Commission?
That would be up to Brian. I don't know if you've seen those 2 sections. We just found that out on Monday during the holiday, going through it. It took a while to go through all line by line. Planning Commission heard a lot more items that were changed than what actually was passed by the ordinance. Legal had taken certain things out, said they didn't want that changed. So we'd have to ask Brian on those 2 sections. But Melissa's here to explain those 2 sections to you.
Yeah, John, could you repeat that? Because the last time I had heard, I would have heard that the cross-referencing had suggested they had reviewed everything. So what are the ones that they didn't review?
It was 14.020C, .020, and the other section was .030.
Both of 14.02C?
Yeah.
14.2, I have written down 20C.
Yeah, 14.20C, 020, and 030.
Okay.
Those are 2 sections we could not find in the staff report from Planning Commission.
Let me take a look at those.
So tonight you'll be able to review it again, and if have to, we could make a motion to amend and pull those 2 sections out.
Thank you, John.
Hi, good afternoon. So regarding those two sections that John was just speaking of, 1420C, 020 and 030, those were part of a new text amendment that we created this spring, the FC3 zone. And when we changed the language to create that FC3 zone, the 030 portion was inadvertently omitted. And it was actually Mr. Jones that pointed out that that had been omitted. So we put that in here. So the Planning Commission has seen this language. as far as 030. And while I was taking that new zone or creating the new zone, there was a simultaneous action by another staff member for the conditional use portion that affected all of the different FC zones. So the 020 changes are just to make the FC3 zone sorry.
Consistent.
Like I can't think of the word. Sorry. Consistent. Thank you. With the other freeway commercial zones. So it's just changes on the conditional uses that are, and the one is the cell towers, and that is a conditional use in all of the zones. So it's just addressing that is a conditional use as identified in the 34-250 section of chapter 14. So do you have other questions that I'm happy to answer?
Mr. Harding.
That explanation was very helpful for the 020 and the 030, which let me get this straight and see. Correct me if I'm misunderstanding this, but we have some stylistic changes.
Yes.
Good with that. We have these two subsections which were not reviewed by, well, the first go around were not reviewed by the planning commission, but were reviewed at other times with these other pieces that you explained very well. So I've got that clear. Is there a third category of minor but still substantive changes that are not part of the 020 and 030, or is there nothing that's in this third category?
I'm not sure I understand your question. I'm sorry.
So some of the changes are stylistic.
Right.
Then there are some substantive changes, and I'm just wondering if all of those are contained in the 020 and 030, or are there some other substantive changes that are outside of those two that you just explained?
As far as I know, no, not that the planning commission has not seen. So everything in this document, the planning commission has seen, just some later that were like the FC3 things that were pointed out, that were added in since this was already going to be coming before you. We just added them in.
Okay. All right.
Councillor Harding, if I could interject and just say, yeah, I think part of the confusion here is because the conversation we were just having was about planning commission review, wasn't immediately clear to me, or I think to Melissa, whether your question was aimed at planning commission review or aimed at this conversation that's happened over the past couple of weeks about what is stylistic and what is substantive. I think the answer to the first question, if you're talking about planning commission, is that everything has been reviewed by them at some point in the past 9 months or more when this omnibus bill has kind of transitioned across multiple projects. Your other question about whether there are things outside of chapter 14.20C in this bill that are substantive goes to kind of the heart of the matter of the discussion that's been happening over the past couple of weeks of what is substantive versus stylistic, and there's not a clear definition of that. So it's kind of in the eye of the beholder whether things are substantive or stylistic. There are things outside of chapter 14.20C in this bill, in this ordinance, that were identified in the memo written by council staff as potentially substantive, but even those things were reviewed by the planning commission.
Okay, thank you. And to me, I agree that this comes down to I'm glad that we've cleared up that everything's been seen by the planning commission. Great, I'm very comfortable with that. It just gets down to is it substantive or not? And I know I'm oversimplifying it here, but you know, the things like the department director or his designee being changed to the department director or the department director's designee, to me, that's purely stylistic. There's no substantive change. It did not change, you know, how those regulations apply to anyone. Whereas if certain no, I'm dropping words, accessory apartments or auxiliary buildings, ancillary buildings, whatever the word is for those. If we're consolidating those and had certain regulations applied to them and others had different regulations applied to them, and now that we're rolling them all together, they're similar but slightly different ones. To me, that is a potentially substantive change, because someone may have been able to do something before, but once we change it, they now have slightly different regulations applied to them. So those are the ones that I'm, if we are going to pass something tonight with those substantive changes, I really feel like I would want to understand what those potentially substantive changes are before I vote on that.
And I think you've got on the screen in front of you now what staff identified as those potentially substantive changes.
I think you're referring to 14A050, where we're talking about the accessory buildings. There were a lot of questions at the last council meeting about that. Is this the one that you're referring to?
This is a good example of what I was referring to, yes.
I had a couple of questions as well. There were some changes in section 8.02.10 and 8.02.180 related to pets that weren't in the Planning Commission. And I assume that's because the Planning Commission doesn't normally review changes in Title VIII.
That's correct.
Is that,
yes, that's correct.
Thank you. One other question I had to do with the religious activities. As I understood it, the change there was any place that religious activities was a conditional use, it was made a permitted use. And then there were some cases where it wasn't mentioned, where it was added as a permitted use. So my question, I guess is probably for Mr. Jones, is does the city even have the ability to regulate whether religious activities are permitted in these zones, or is that covered by a federal law that would apply to every zone?
Well, I'm assuming that this is in that this code number is in the I'm struggling to kind of articulate this, but I'm assuming that this code number is in the Uniform Building Code because it is a designated land use. And so I don't think we're talking about, can you say prayers in every zone? I think we're talking about, can you use a structure for religious purposes in a certain zone? And certainly that's within the city's zoning prerogative.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions? And I think we'll see you tonight on this issue then. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Let's move on to item number 10, a discussion on the Westside Development Pipeline to be presented by Councillor Harding.
Thank you. I was a bit surprised when I saw my name on this as well, but I guess it's been a couple of weeks, but yeah, I did push us forward at the beginning. Basically, we have asked the Planning Commission and our planners to work on clarifying some of the development policies for West Provo, and they're working on that, and it's going to come back to us. I was concerned that in that interim, we may either have some proposals, applications that come in and they would like a decision on it before those policies are refined, or more likely an application would come in before we finalize that, and then there would be an argument made that, well, we should apply the old policies to that application rather than the new policies. And so I floated the idea of an intent statement that would just communicate to stakeholders to let them know what to expect. And basically the idea is, in my mind, the main idea here is for people that get their applications in before we finalize those clarifications, just to let them know that we still plan to apply these clarifications to projects whose applications came in during this interim period. I'll go ahead and read this. I really appreciate Mr. Jones's work on this. It came out very different than I originally drafted, and I'm not thrilled with a lot of this verbiage, but he has convinced me that it's probably in our best interest to go forward with this language. But the Municipal Council of Provo City desires to put developers, property owners, and other stakeholders on notice of its intent to clarify and implement policies contained in the West Side Development Policies and Southwest Area Future Land Use Map documents in the near future. While those policies are under consideration, we anticipate that it will be difficult for the council to determine that proposed rezones in the area are appropriate. We do not desire anyone to incur expenses and spend time on proposed applications without being aware of the process that we are undertaking. While all applications received will be handled in accordance with the law and will receive full consideration, we encourage developers with proposals in the area affected by those policies to hold those proposals until after our effort has concluded, so that they may have the full benefit of the final policies to consider in making their plans. So that's the proposed language. And again, the idea is just to make everyone aware that we're refining these and that we plan to put these policies into effect. So that's my presentation.
Questions for Mr. Harding? Mr. Shipley.
Yeah, I wonder if we have any expectation on ETA from planning. I mean, I guess it's open-ended enough. I just want to make sure we're not talking about a 6 or 12-month process.
Yeah, to the extent I can answer that, I asked Bill Pepperoni about where they're at with it. They are planning on having a study session to discuss them, but in the meantime, it's my understanding the questions have been all forwarded to planning commissioners with a request for feedback on them. And that'll help move the process along. So sooner than later.
Councilor Ellsworth.
Yeah, I just want to say I'm supportive of this concept, this statement, and this idea. I guess I'm just maybe concerned or hopeful that the planning staff, who has a lot on their plate, feels comfortable managing this with developers. It seems like maybe the intent hasn't been portrayed to developers in the past, and I hope in the interim that the intent is portrayed to developers.
Mr. Strachan.
Might I suggest that we ask Mr. Jones to kind of give us a sense of the extent and limits to what this does for the council and for developers, because the way I read it, and it may be down the road while you're still waiting for those things that something comes forward that you do want to address, and then you've got to think about whether or not you want to, whether in fact you're actually creating a moratorium here or how you're proceeding. But I think it would be helpful for Brian to give some context.
Yeah, so let me, I guess, frame the discussion by talking about what your alternatives are. So you can, in fact, under state law, impose a temporary zoning regulation, which can, in fact, create a moratorium on development in certain areas. But there's some parameters to that. One is that can only last for 6 months. And the second one is that you have to find what the legal term is a compelling countervailing public interest that supports the moratorium versus continued development. And you have to be able to articulate what that compelling countervailing interest is. So one of the conversations that we had prior to this meeting was that that was an option. If you're not going, but the trying to do that without actually passing the moratorium is problematic. So an effort to say we won't approve your developments, but we're not going to actually take the step of following the process for doing that in state law by imposing a moratorium by ordinance and by finding the countervailing public compelling interest is problematic. So the discussion was, if there's interest for a moratorium, then fine, that's the council's prerogative and the council can go down that road. That's a different process than merely issuing a statement. And so in that case, the statement needs to do what I think this one does, which is put people on notice of concerns without actually binding either the council or them. This doesn't say you can't apply. It doesn't say we won't process your application. It doesn't say we have pre-decided your applications and won't approve them no matter what the circumstances are. It says we're putting you on notice that we are taking some other steps. Those steps likely affect how we will view your application, and don't submit your application and then come complain to us that you spent a lot of money on your application, not knowing that we were considering making changes, because we're putting you on notice that we're considering making changes.
Mr. Chair.
Yes, Mr. Harding.
If I can thank you, Mr. Jones. I really appreciate the way that you discussed that. And let me just throw out one more time that the way that I understand these policies, having voted on them and having had a hand in developing them, I think, all of the mixed housing types that we're talking about, I think are all not just consistent with those policies, but are actually intended by these policies. And so I don't see this as like a change to our policies, maybe a change to our practices, but not a change to our policies. But I concede that these policies are broad enough that they could be interpreted different ways. And so that's why I've been talking about it as a clarification on these policies. And so I would not support a moratorium, and I still feel like a developer could easily come in and understand kind of the temperature of the council and come forward with a proposal that I would find meeting the policies that have already been passed, and I think everyone would be happy to consider that application and move forward with it. But while we are working on these clarifications, I think it's good to kind of make sure everyone is aware of these so no one is taken by surprise.
Thank you. Other comments? Mr. Hanley?
Yeah, I agree with what's been said. I don't think a moratorium is what we're looking for. So I would move that we adopt this statement.
Motion by Mr. Hanley.
I'll second.
Second by Councilor Ellsworth. Is there any discussion on the motion? I'd just like to express my reservations about this. I appreciate Councilor Harding's work over many years on developing these policies, but I don't feel comfortable sending a negative signal to developers that I guess I'll just speak for myself, that I might not vote for a project that I haven't even seen yet. So that's my concern. Any other comments before I call for a vote? All in favor? That's Counselor here is in the chambers is Counselor Harding and Counselor Hanley. And now I'll do a roll call vote starting from the left of my screen. Counselor Shipley,
Yes.
Counselor Fillmore,
Yes.
Counselor Ellsworth,
Yes.
Counselor Hoban.
Yes.
And so that is 6 votes in favor, and I will vote no. Counselor Sewell opposed. Thank you. Let's go on to item. Oh, that is actually the last item of the work session. There has been a request for a closed session. Mr. Jones, could you?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. There has been a request for a closed session. It does deal with competence and character of an individual, and therefore is a permitted reason for a closed meeting. So it'd be appropriate to close the meeting at this time.
Look for a motion to close the meeting.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Harding,
Second.
second by Mr. Hanley, I think. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? 3 counselors here vote in favor. Mr. Fillmore?
Yeah.
Mr. Hoban?
Yes.
Mr. Counselor Ellsworth?
Yes.
And Counselor Shipley?
Yes.
Thank you. We will now adjourn and go into closed session. About what time would that be?
We're anticipating 4:20. That gives us about 14 minutes.
About 4:20. So those that are here will meet up in the conference room, and those who are joining by Zoom, we'll see you in a few.